With tape recorder in hand, I interviewed Gone with the Wind actress Butterfly McQueen, tap dancer Honey Coles, historian John Henrik Clark, 99-year-old actor Lee Whipper, born in 1876. I would return for research on the Harlem Renaissance poet-writer Langston Hughes, tape recorder also in hand.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in honor of the History Makers. My name is Daymond John. I'm known these days for my role on ABC's Shark Tank, but it was in 2003 that the History Makers traveled to New York City to the FUBU offices to interview me for the archives. I was the youngest interviewee at the time, just 36 years old. Initially operating out of the trunk of my car and my mother's house in Queens with a sewing machine and my partners Keith, Carl, and Jay, we started a new industry of hip-hop apparel that would attract international clientele. Now, I cannot say that I understood then the importance of my History Makers interview, but I have to say, I do now. My interview, like others, are now housed permanently at the Library of Congress. 2020 has brought a lot of attention to the obstacles that Black entrepreneurs face. And that is why being here tonight means so much to me. In 2006, the History Makers honored 3 great Black men, General Colin Powell in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Andrew Young in Atlanta, and the founder and CEO of Black Enterprise magazine, Earl Graves Sr. in Chicago, Illinois. This would be the first time they would honor a business leader for the History Makers, an Evening with PBSTV series. Let's take a look at that year in review.
We'll be shooting a nice wide shot. Do we need to record that music?
We're going the other direction.
Dear and trusted friend, Earl Graves has an incredible set.
Carol, is Julieanna up?
Well, I just see a little bit of this and I see...
You have my speech.
Henry Parks, Edward Brooke, and I to serve on his advisory board.
Tape on
It's very important for people to have a sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense of history, of where they came from. People go from Harriet Tubman to Martin Luther King, and the same names being mentioned over and over again. And yet I would talk to people and I would hear these wonderful stories about their families or people that influenced them, names that were not in the public venue as much. We actually interview people for 2.5 hours, and we ask them to bring photographs of themselves, and we have them narrate them. With the advent of new technologies, these archives will be searchable by image and text.
And there was what is known as the Old Bunch Plantation outside of Raleigh, North Carolina.
We have a very strong educational initiative to really bring this history to life and for people to see these stories, and these people. But our goal is really to record this information, and we say that this is America's missing stories, that American history really won't be complete without this information.
Father's admonition was, what message have they come? You're no better than anybody else. Nobody's better than you.
It's the first chapter.
Scramble all the time, and you're thinking all the time. Those qualities that give you a proclamation.
Tonight, though, we're here to celebrate one of the Goodman Theatre's own, theatrical director Chuck Smith. Many of you have seen and admired his work over the years, even if you had never seen the man himself, as I had not. Most of us do not know his history, which is why we are here tonight.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Colin Powell. Please have a seat. Good evening. General Powell, thank you so much for being here this evening. You honor us with your presence.
Thank you very much, Juan, and I'd like to express my thanks to the History Makers and to Julieanna for bringing us all together this evening on this important occasion.
Stand by. Can we just start? Can you just greet her again?
I was born at the beginning of an era of enormous change. Change so great, it will be called the Second American Revolution.
The modern world was in crisis, and with that crisis came an opportunity for my generation to change America in a way that was good news for all Americans.
We were trying to change America morally. We would redeem the soul of America.
I am Andrew Young.
I am Andrew Young.
I am Andrew Young.
Please join me in welcoming Andrew Young.
Wait, there we go. Okay, let's do it again.
Well, he was in New York. I trained up there right away.
How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good evening. Tonight we honor a man I greatly admire, Earl G. Graves, Sr. This publishing giant and luminary of American business is a man whom my late father, John H. Johnson, respected. And even more importantly, my dad considered Earl Graves a dear and trusted friend. Did you know that Earl Graves and my father went out on sales calls together? That's right. When advertisers and agencies acted a bit slow to understand how important Black enterprise and ebony were for them to reach African American consumers, those two dynamos teamed up and called on them together. Can you imagine Earl Graves and John Johnson lighting up a room with their extreme persuasion?
I am eternally thankful to Earl Graves. Grateful because he is responsible for much of our success tonight. Just a note about how I met Earl Graves. I met him in August of 2000. Just to give perspective, we just did our first interview in February of 2000. Most people thought harebrained idea, harebrained scheme. They didn't really understand. Archives sound old and dusty and not of much use. But I met him on this cruise, and let's say he could run, but he could not hide, and I was chasing him like I was chasing a lot of people on the cruise that time.
captive audience, you know. He listened to me talk about the history makers and he immediately sat for an interview and then encouraged others to sit. He got Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee to come. He got Susan Taylor to come and she wrote letters on our behalf. So really tonight is a special one. Now the History Makers Archive houses individual stories that are forming an intricate tapestry of the fundamental truth of history. In this history, truth, guilt, shame take a backseat to witness. Our grandmothers become more important than our textbooks. The next door neighbor holds more authority than the New York Times. And stories like the ones you are going to hear tonight, become the sole arbiters and creators of our past. It is really important that these stories are not forgotten, that they are documented and shared. Now, we must get on with our show. This eldest child of Julia and Horace Mann Bond, this leader of SNCC, this movement activist turned politician, this elder statesman, this chairman of the board of the NAACP, this nationally syndicated journalist, teacher, and civil rights leader. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce tonight's host, the one and only Mr. Julian Bond.
Thank you. Thank you. Earl Graves and I met in the crucible of tremendous change. So it was in 1969, 1 year after Robert Kennedy's death, that he'd asked Charles Evers, Shirley Chisholm, John Lewis, Andrew Brimmer, William Hudgens, Henry Parks Jr., Edward Brooke, and I to join the advisory board of this new magazine and help open the doors to corporate America. It is my great pleasure and my great honor to introduce to you Mr. Earl G. Graves, Sr.
Oh, my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, till he comes. Oh, my Jesus, 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 oh, my Jesus.
Just gotta get the sideburns going and you're all set, baby.
Clapped in church on Sunday morning, and Grandma's Hayes played a tambourine so well. Grandma's Hayes used to usher out a woman. She said, Billy, don't you run so fast. You might fall on a piece of glass, and there might be snakes in that grass low. Grandma's Hayes, you know that Grandma's Hayes soothed the local unwed mother. used to ache sometimes and swell. Grandma's hands used to lift the face and tell her, she said, baby, grandma, understand that you really love that man, but 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 that man, and that man. Put yourself in Jesus' hands. Put yourself in Jesus' hands. Put yourself in grandma's hands. And put yourself in grandma's hands. Well, well, well. Like the way you work it. You know that grandma's hands used to hand me a piece of candy, and grandma's hands picked me up each time I felt old. Grandma's hands, boy, they really came in handy. She said, Matcha, don't you whip that boy. Say, what you want to spank him for? He didn't drop no apple core, but I don't have grandma anymore. And if I get to heaven, I'll look for. If I get to heaven, I'll look. Matcha, don't you whip that boy. If I get to heaven, I'll look for what you want to spank him for. If I get to heaven, I'll look for. He didn't drop no apple core, but I don't have grandma anymore. If I get to heaven, I'll look for. Matcha, won't you whip that boy? What you? If I get to heaven, I'll look for. Matcha, don't you whip that boy? If I get to heaven, I'll look for it. I'll look for. If I get to heaven, if I get to heaven, if I get to Matcha, don't you whip that boy, sit there. What you want to spank him for, sit. He didn't drop no, he didn't drop no, he didn't drop no, he didn't drop no, he didn't drop the, he didn't drop the, he didn't drop the, he didn't drop no, drop the, he didn't drop the, he didn't drop no, drop the, If I get to heaven, I'll look for grandma's hand. Grandma's hand.
As you can see, the History Makers continued its work. And in 2006, they were able to add 263 history makers to the archives. That year, many came from across the United States to honor a great man, business icon, Earl Graves. After all, his life work has been dedicated to showcasing the work of entrepreneurs like myself and opening the doors in corporate America to thousands of Black people. Tonight, we want you to see some of the magic at the Goodman Theatre in Chicago as civil rights leader Julieanna Bond interviews the founder of Black Enterprise magazine, Mr. Earl Graves Sr.
The following program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org. New York was his birthplace. From Green Beret to aide to Bobby Kennedy, he rose to one of the nation's most successful publishers with Black Enterprise magazine. A pioneering entrepreneur, a faithful family man, and a leading voice for social change. Earl Graves epitomizes the strength of the American dream. The History Makers is proud to present An Evening with Earl Graves, with host, civil rights activist, and civic leader, Julieanna Bond.
Good evening. Earl Graves and I met in the crucible of tremendous change. America was in turmoil. Martin Luther King had just been assassinated. Robert Kennedy called a meeting of Black leaders in Atlanta the day before the funeral was to be held. That was at that meeting that I first met Earl Graves. We'd meet again at the funeral of Robert Kennedy. It was in that moment where one examines and explores oneself that the idea of Black Enterprise magazine was born. So it was in 1969, 1 year after Kennedy's death, that he'd asked Charles Evers, Shirley Chisholm, John Lewis, Andrew Brimmer, William Hudgens, Henry Parks Jr., and Edward Brooke, and me to serve on his advisory board and to help open the doors to corporate America.
Oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. Oh, Mary, oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Church in the high, rocking Jerusalem. Ringing them bells, church in the high, rocking Jerusalem, ringing them bells. Oh, Mary, oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. Oh, Mary, oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Rocking Jerusalem, ringing them bells. Rocking Jerusalem. Ringing them bells.
Tonight, audience, you and I are going to go together down memory lane. Is that right? And it's going to start right now. Earl, we've known each other, it's hard to believe, for 38 years. You were Bobby Kennedy's right hand on his staff. I was in the Georgia State Senate. We met at Martin Luther King's funeral. A meeting was called to Black leadership the day before the funeral. What are your memories of the time and the place when that occurred?
First of all, the people who were there, Eartha Kitt, not a civil rights leader in the first instance, Andy Young, John Lewis, Perry Belafonte, and many others that you would expect, Jose Williams, who was very much involved in the civil rights movement. And we were kind of at a loss what we were going to do. Martin wasn't here. There was rioting already going on all over the country. And we sat there and we talked, and at least we agreed that we had to try to do something to stem whatever the violence was, and how were we going to do that? We left that meeting with a sense that we had to carry on for Martin. He would have wanted it that way. I think that both Julian and John Lewis spoke to that in a very eloquent way that night. And 2 months to the day that we had that meeting with Robert Kennedy asking to have the meeting, Robert Kennedy was assassinated.
Now, you were traveling with him at that time on his staff. He's running for president, winning the California primary that night. What do you remember about that night?
Well, first of all, I remember the tragedy of the thing of being outside of the hotel because we were going back over, Barbara and I, to see where our sons were. They were across the street in Beverly, Wilshire.
Yeah.
And
Earl, you can look at me while you're talking.
Okay, all right, good.
They can see it on the big screen.
Okay. I've been trying hard for 40 years to get along with you. You don't make it easy. In any event, this tragedy happened with Kennedy, and I heard about it because some staff member came out and said he thought that he had heard some shots inside. And I told him to take my wife and go back across to the hotel across the street, and I would check it out. And just about that time, some policemen jumped out of police cars. And I remember them saying when John Kennedy was assassinated that the policemen slugged anybody who was nearby. So they said, where are we going? I happened to know where the basement was. And I said, I know where it is. And all the way down the stairs, I remember saying to these policemen, remember, I worked for Senator Kennedy. Remember, I worked for Senator Kennedy, not knowing what I'd see. As we got to the bottom of the stairs, to the right was a door that had been swung open, and Rosie Greer already had Sirhan with his arm broken on the table, on a steam table. And as we pushed the door open, right in front of me was Robert Kennedy lying on the floor with his life ebbing away. It was a seminal moment in my life in terms of the tragedy of the thing. And to lose two leaders like that close together, it was a matter now, what am I going to do?
And at that time, you had already come further along than your family might have expected, that you might have expected. Let's take a look.
It was 1935, and the country was in the depths of the Great Depression.
Our immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress. Its first objective is to put men and women now on the relief rolls to work.
In New York's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, Earl Graves was born the eldest son of Earl Godwin Graves and Winifred Colette Seeley Graves. His father, a strict disciplinarian, worked for Overland Garment Company in New York City's garment district. He also sold women's dresses wholesale out of the family's living room on weekends. His mother, small in frame but strong in spirit, kept the family together. Once, when her son was forbidden to use the pool at the Brooklyn Central YMCA, Mrs. Graves took the issue into her own hands. Shortly thereafter, the pool was integrated. The Graves family attended St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Brooklyn, and everyone in the Graves household was expected to earn good grades and mind their manners. Earl would begin his first job selling Christmas cards for his Uncle John, but it would be Uncle Joe, a pharmacist, who would be his mentor. An athlete, Graves was one of 20 black students out of 7,500 at his father's alma mater, Erasmus Hall High School in the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. Graves commuted 2 hours per day to attend school. He also worked part-time at the Brooklyn Public Library, where he met a man named Sam Young. Young saw potential in young Earl and encouraged him to attend the historically black university, Morgan State. Earl visited Morgan and immediately fell in love with the campus and campus life and wanted to attend college there. It was Uncle Joe's encouragement and Earl's odd jobs and small business ventures that would make this possible. Doing so would change the course of Earl Graves' life.
Now, Earl, tell us, what was it like growing up in Bedford-Stuyvesant then? I think all of us have some image of New York City if we've never been there or seen it, but what about Brooklyn? What about your childhood?
There was family. I mean, there was a sense of village. If you did something wrong, Mrs. Williams, who lived about 2 doors down from me, kind of policed the block from the 3rd floor. And if I did something wrong, she would see it, not mention anything to me other than call me. And as my father was coming home from work very tired, about 6 o'clock, she would whisper down to him, the boy did something wrong.
And you were the boy.
And my father was not a reasonable person, so, I clearly remember that if he would eat, that meant that he would say, come with me, and I'd walk down the street like it was the death march. And my friends would walk with me, and they'd have conversations. What do you think he'll hit him with? I don't know, belt. What do you knowing full well that the next night it could very well be them. But he tried to be a loving parent, my dad, but he was an orphan by the time he was 16 years old. And raising his younger brother, my Uncle Joe, who became the pharmacist. And so there were times when I wished that he and I had been closer. He was proud of the things that I did. He didn't want me to go away to Morgan. He thought that was frivolous, that why do you have to go away and live and pay for rent? Although I was going to pay the rent, that why you want to live on a campus, you don't have to do that. You ought to really be at home, and you can study and do what you need to do. I think in a way I really wanted to get away. And I went away the first year with about $617 saved and had a bunch of odd jobs, as you've seen. And there's several guys in this room that I probably still owe some money to for flowers they paid too much money for.
What about your mother? And what about your brothers and sisters?
Well, we were close. My mother was tough. That YMCA thing that you talk about, I came home and I said, Mom, there's a problem. I had been able to go and swim in this Y just once. I was part of the colored YMCA. It was Carlton Avenue Y. They took us over to swim in this pool, which to me looked like an ocean compared to the pool we were swimming at the Carlton Y. So I came out and I said, what do you have to, I said to the guy, and I was maybe 10 years old, what do you have to do to swim here? He said, you just have to remember the Y. I said, well, that's great. So the next day, instead of going back to the Carlton Y, I went right back to this Brooklyn Y, the main Y. And I finished swimming. The instructor, the lifeguard said to me, the guy that runs the place would like to see you. And I said, well, fine. I got dressed and came upstairs, and he said, young man, you know, we have a Y for your people, you boys. And I knew right away because my mother had armed me to get ready for any kind of nonsense. And he said, we expect you to swim at that Y, and this Y is for our people, the white boys. And I said to myself, my mother's not going to like this. So I said, yes, sir. And he said, so you won't come back? I said, no, sir. And I said to myself, I'll be back. And I went home and told my mother. And it was too late that evening, fortunately for him, to not go back. Next morning, my mother was up and told my sisters and my sister, two sisters, my brother, she would be back. And she told one of the tenants upstairs to listen out for her. She put her hat on, and when my mother pulled her hat down on her head, that meant the bad things were going to happen. Yeah. And then she put on her white gloves. Pocketbook on her arm, the guy was going to be in trouble. And the Y got integrated that afternoon.
All right. So, now, before you were even thinking about Morgan State College, you went to Erasmus Hall High School, which is your father's alma mater. How'd that come about?
My father decided he wanted me to go to the same high school that he did, and contrary to what people think, New York was very segregated in terms of how the schools were set up. You were parceled off, if you will. Maybe that's crude, but to certain schools, we had about 4 schools that we could pick from, and my father said, I want you to go to Erasmus, and I said, well, you know, Dad, that's not in the district. He said, well, I'm going to talk to somebody. And even back then, politics being politics, although he talked to his boss, and the guy knew someone at the high school, and they said, well, if he can study Greek, he can go to the high school. My father said he will study Greek. Got there, and I got to tell you, I never spent a day studying Greek, but I had great 3.5 years at that school.
What was the racial composition when you went there?
There were 7,500 students. 7,400 were white. And it was, if they ever said we're going to have a race riot, it would have been bad because there only were 20 Negroes then. And so out of the 7,400 students, that's what the ratio was.
Well, you get out of high school, and you've already said your father didn't want you to go away to Morgan, but your Uncle Joe financed your education.
Well, that would be overstatement. I told him I was going to borrow about $300 a year from him, never intended to pay it back, but And he said, fine. And so when I think the tuition is about $618 a year for out-of-state students. I mean, keep in mind that library they talked about before I was getting paid 57 cents an hour. Uncle Joe helped me, and I didn't ask him the first time. The first time I left, I had about enough money to cover going to Morgan for its first year. The second time, I was working during the summer. I had 2 or 3 jobs. I waited tables. I was a lifeguard. I was a waiter. And so I had saved money, and I knew something about mentoring. When I was 19 years old, a junior at Morgan, walking down Lewis Avenue, Bedford-Stuyvesant, I saw a friend of mine coming towards me, Walter Lee, who I knew we used to play hide and seek around the corner. And I said to Walter, Walter, how are things going? He said, well, I just got out of the Air Force. And I said, wow, what are you doing? And he said, I'm back at Wise. And Wise was a shoe shine parlor. So I said, you mean you shine his shoes? He said, well, yeah, I'm trying to decide what I want to do. And I said, well, didn't they give you a GI Bill? He said, yeah. I said, well, why don't you go to college? He said, well, where would I go? So I said, why don't you go to Morgan? And he said, well, how will I do that? I said, look, I'm going back in a couple of days, and you can ride the bus with me. And he said, no. He said, we'll take my father's car. He won't know. And, and so we got in the car, went down to Morgan, and Walter Lee was enrolled within 2 weeks. We ended up calling him the Roach because he never had a room the entire 4 years he was in school. Really?
No.
Let me just finish this point. I know I'm off the track. But the point is, I want to say that you can mentor because in this audience tonight is Dr. Walter Lee, surgeon dentist. Where's Walter Lee? Right there.
Now, while you're at Morgan, you joined the ROTC to help pay for college, but you also were creative in coming up with different ways of making money. What did you do?
First of all, I wanted to go to the Penn Relays, and I was the slowest guy on Morgan's track team ever. And I defy anyone to say differently. And so I wanted to go to Penn Relays, and I was walking down the street, and I said, wow, I wonder who cuts all the grass for these people. I'd already had a flower business. I was responsible for all the flowers that came on the campus. And my deal with the florist was anybody who comes into your store from Morgan and buying flowers, I get 10%. And he said, well, how will I know they're from Morgan? I said, do you know of any white students going to Morgan? So that was fairly simple, a dumb question, but simple. But, and so I looked, and here was this opportunity. All of these lawns looked like they needed cutting, so I took a piece of paper, made up a mimeograph form, put the phone number, the dean's office on the piece of paper, and figured maybe I'd get a half a dozen phone calls, and it went up and down each door, putting these flyers in about 100 doors of the houses. And this happened on a Saturday, so Monday I'm in class, and a person comes into the class that I was in and hands the teacher a note, and the teacher shakes his or her head. And at the end of the class, he said to me, Mr. Graves, would you see me for a moment? So I said, absolutely. And I said, what is he? He said, the dean wants to see you. So I said, I didn't actually remember the flyers. So I got back, and his secretary was there, and she said, wow, he is really looking for you. So I go in, and the dean says, what is this? He said, when did I become your secretary? So without thinking about it, I looked down and I looked at all that work and I said, wow, Dean, I could use you to help me work, right? So tonight is a seminal moment in my life because who can imagine that they will grow up to have an audience of your friends and peers who will come together to allow you to tell your grandchildren what your life has been like and to tell them and remind them of how wonderful their grandmother is. We've been married 46 years. She is the matriarch of... I'm not in charge tonight, but I was asking her to stand up. You see how influential I was. But in any event, will you wave? You'll wave at least, right? There you go. All right. That's considered winning in my family. She's our moral compass. She's our intellectual compass. And when my sons, when I tell my sons we're going to do something, they say, have you run that past Mom yet? I said, I'm in charge. They said, I know, but run it past Mom anyway. So, I mean, imagine being able to do this tonight and that my grandchildren will tell their children and they will tell their children. And I expect that to happen.
Now, some people don't know that you were once in the real estate business, and I'm guessing this stemmed from a lecture you heard from Professor Spaulding.
Right. You must have some crib notes, do you? Very
Oh,
good.
yes.
I wanted to know what I was going to do when I got out of the service. I wanted to have something planned, and so I went to this lecture, and the guy started talking about real estate. Now, back then in Baltimore, you really had three options. There were no recruiters on campus at any colleges, much less African-American schools. That was on IBM and PepsiCo and Philip Morris. That was 25 years away before that was going to happen. So you had a choice. You could either work for the government, coming out of Morgan, that was, in the Social Security Administration right there in Baltimore. You could teach school, which was something else you could do. Or you could, because of the ROTC, you could go on active duty. Well, at that time, I pretty much was sure I wasn't going to want to stay in, because I knew that I wanted to make money, and I wasn't going to make the kind of money being in the service I wanted, but I knew I had an obligation, and I felt that obligation, and I thought that it would be good training, which it was. And so went into the Army, came out, and the first thing I did was call a real estate. Got the yellow pages, just flipped to there was a real estate office by my house. Called and said that I had a very experienced real estate salesman that I wanted to come over, and could I send him over? And he said, well, how soon can you send him over? And I said, I'm going to call him for you, and I'll let you know. All right? And so I hung up the phone, called back, and said, hi. My friend just told me you're interested in talking to me. He said, yeah, can you come over? I said, I'll be right there. And literally, you have to do these things sometime. And literally got the job as a salesman. And in the first 3 months, now by that time, Barbara and I had met.
How'd you meet her?
On a blind date. I was with Walter Fulcher, who, a fraternity brother who was also in the Army. He was here with me, and he said, look, there's a lady that is a friend of another friend. And I said, well, this may be her lucky day, you know, one of those kind of things. One of the, you know, I mean, you have to understand, Walter and I had, you know, we had shiny boots, and I mean, I jumped out of airplanes, and I was making $260 a month. You couldn't tell me anything. And so we had this date, and we met, and she was very attractive, very bright, and not impressed at all by my, you know, Army outfit on. And also, you and I are leg people, right? She had big legs. Right? You and me, right?
There you go. All right. So you meet on the blind date. She's not impressed with you. But now you've been married 46 years. How'd that happen?
Well, I gave her my phone number, and you know, 'cause I mean, that was.
You gave her your phone number.
Exactly. All right, this is becoming painful, but let's keep going.
All right.
I gave her my phone number, and she said, what is this? I said, that's my number at the post. If you call, the first sergeant will get a hold of me. She said, I don't call guys. So then I said, should I tell her about the fraternity or who I am? And you know, none of that mattered. And so 3 weeks went by, and I never got this phone call. So I called her, and I said, did you lose the number? She said, no, I told you I don't call guys. And I said, look, I better have another date with you because you're obviously confused.
Where'd you go on your second date?
See, Julian's asking about the second date, and this is totally not necessary, Julian, because he knows the deal. But in any event, I got to her house. By this time, I had on my civilian clothes, and I had a 1955 Buick with about 57 cents worth of gas in it. And so I said to her, what would you like to do? Praying that she would not say the movies, because, you know, $240 a month, $270 a month, it was going to be tough. And she said, well, I'll do whatever you want to do. So I said, well, how would you like to go out to the airport? And she said, I would love that. I said, whoa, right. So, you know, I said, this is it. You know, and so I'm humming to myself as I'm driving to the airport, and I get to where I would usually park, and
Earl, your boys are loving this.
In any event, I parked the car, and she said, what is this? So I said, what do you mean? She said, how can I see the airplanes from here? So I said, when I could get my breath, I said, let me understand it. You really came out here to see airplanes? I told you we did not need to discuss the second date.
Well, that's okay. So now real estate and politics come into your life. Let's take a look.
In 1960, Graves left full-time military service and joined the National Guard, becoming part of the 19th Special Forces Group, the Green Berets. A civilian job with Ajax Realty led Graves to hone his sales skills and build some assets for his young family. But Graves would have his eyes on politics. Times were changing, and he wanted to be a part of the change.
Yes, as I gaze upon this great historic assembly, this unprecedented gathering of young people, I cannot help thinking that 100 years from now, the historians will be calling this not the Beat generation, but the generation of integration.
His efforts to join the local Democratic Party were rebuffed, but his organizing efforts would catch the attention of Bobby Kennedy during the Johnson-Humphrey presidential campaign. Shortly after, Graves was offered a job on Bobby Kennedy's staff. The hours were long and exhausting, but Graves relied on his military skills and work ethic. Kennedy's mantra was, "The unbelievable takes a day, impossible takes a week." With Earl by his side, the senator started a redevelopment project in Graves' own Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood. For the first time, Graves saw the elite part of American society.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
But it all took a tragic turn when Bobby Kennedy was killed. Graves had a wife and 3 young sons and was suddenly out of work. He and the other Kennedy staffers would be given Ford Foundation grants. Graves took his grant and headed toward his ancestors' home of Barbados, where he found blacks in power, but lacking economic resources to make change. Graves' idea for a newsletter would become the model for Black Enterprise magazine, and in 1970, after taking out a $175,000 SBA loan, Black Enterprise magazine was born. That same year, Essence magazine was started. The Minority Enterprise Small Business Corps began. Henry Parks became the first African-American CEO to take his company public, and George Johnson's Johnson Products Company stock became the first African-American company to be traded on the American Stock Exchange. Blacks were starting to enter corporate America in record numbers, and Graves assembled an advisory board composed of community leaders to open up the doors to corporate America. He would present to ad executives who would turn a deaf ear, but he continued selling, and slowly but surely, doors to corporate America began to open, and Black Enterprise magazine and its readership grew significantly. Earl G. Graves Limited had essentially tapped an untapped market.
You go to Barbados, you get this Ford Foundation grant, you go to Barbados, and I know that's your ancestral home, your family home, but why'd you do that?
I wanted to see with a country that was run by people, the natives of that country, what the economic impact of that was. And I got there and was greatly disappointed because they weren't in charge of the businesses. They were in charge of the government. But when it came to who owned the bank was owned by Barclays Bank, and who owned the department store downtown was a white Bajan, and who owned the largest supermarket chain was another white Bajan. And so it was disheartening to me because I had in my mind that I was going to go there and see that the highways were being built by Bajans, and that was not in fact the case. And that's not an indictment of just Barbados. The same thing is true of any place you would go in the Caribbean, and for that matter, in many instances even today.
Yeah. So the seeds of the idea of these people running everything but the business, was that a little seed in your mind that became the newsletter, and the newsletter again became the magazine?
It was, because I clearly thought that we could do better back in the States. The Barry Rands of the world were coming along, the Wayman Smiths were coming along. Wayman went from being a lawyer to becoming a corporate executive. you had to go out and get a job and work in the Senate. I don't say that facetiously, but I mean, you know, the civil rights, that wasn't a great paying job.
No, it didn't pay well.
No. So there was opportunity. And so the idea of the magazine came along, but it was a single entity and stayed a single entity for quite some time.
What role did the advisors play? How did I help?
One of the most difficult things was then, 36 years ago, and is today, to get in the door to be able to tell your story. And so when I started writing to these companies and saying, look, I have a magazine with upscale African Americans and people in the professions and people who are running businesses, one, I wouldn't even get an answer by the letters, and then I'd call up and ask, had the letter arrived, because I hadn't gotten a reply. And that there was no response. I mean, it wasn't moving the way it needed to. And so I said to Julian, and I said to John Lewis, look, I'm going to write a different kind of letter. So I'd like to drop by to Hertz, for example. It was one of the places, if you remember, we went. Yes. I wrote them and said, I'd like to drop by and see you, and I'd like to bring two of my associates, Julian Bond, the civil rights leader, and John Lewis, who will be out of jail by that time. And we'd like to visit you to see what your thoughts are about doing business with African Americans. Well, what a change in attitude, you know. Now, I can't say that everybody rolled over and played dead, but Shirley Chisholm, if you can imagine Shirley Chisholm going on an advertising call with me. Senator Brooke was the complete diplomat, but when he came out of the room, they were slapping each other on the back, and it was still happening. Andrew Brimmer took no prisoners. I mean, he was absolutely incredible in terms of writing a letter and then expecting that company to respond. And he was already serving on a couple of the boards where we were trying to do business, which did make a difference. So to make Julian happy, the advisory board played a very, very important role.
Well, I remember this trip we took and talked to the CEO, not to the advertising people, because they hadn't responded to you. What was their attitude before?
They raised the question of whether or not we would bring the cars back. Right? And
that's what I was looking for.
Okay, and so, but I don't know, it was just that racist. They said, you know, they envisioned that we were going to drop them all off in some disenfranchised neighborhood, and, you know, first the tires would go and then the car would go. So let us say it was a bit of a challenge in some instances.
But I remember you had assembled this tremendous list of a kind you could buy today, but it didn't exist then. Every black football player, every black basketball player, every black professional, every black doctor, every black dentist, every black CPA, down the list of all the professions. Was this helpful in convincing these people who didn't believe that this market existed?
Absolutely. What I had compiled was a list of the leading African-American professionals and business people in the country. I'd gone to the Urban League, and Whitney Young wanted to be very helpful. He told me where he thought the best list could be found. He didn't want to compromise the members of his organization by outright giving me the list, but he opened some doors for me in terms of getting there.
So many magazines start up and disappear and we never hear them again, but by the 10th issue, you're profitable. Now, how'd you do that when so many people fail?
Well, first of all, I made up my mind that we were going to have a quality product. We set certain guidelines for ourselves in terms of what we were going to do at the book, and we used the word book and magazine interchangeably. We set a value system that said if we couldn't do it right, we weren't going to do it at all. And I tried to do that with everything, not just with a magazine. And so we challenged the editorial people. You've got to get it right. And I didn't, quite frankly, I didn't know that 9 out of 10 magazines failed to begin with. So I kept right on plowing along. Pat Patterson was our initial editor. We have 2 outstanding editors now, Derek Dingle and Alfred Edmond, who are senior people who are here tonight. And they still carry on that same tradition, which is what allows us to be as good as we are. The thing that made the magazine what it is today is what it was Black Enterprise when we started is today a brand. When you say Black Enterprise, we're talking about the private equity company that we have in terms of how that interfaces. We're talking about the golf and tennis event that we have every year where anywhere 1,200, 1,500 people show up. We're talking about the Women of Power Conference. We're talking about these 2 television shows we have and what we're doing with those. And so Butch and Johnny and Michael have really taken this, and their co-workers have taken this thing to a new level. And as a matter of fact, I'm actually staying home at least 2 days a week now.
Now, I'm going to ask the question everyone in this room wants to ask. Why are you wearing those sideburns?
I thought you said you were going to keep this at a high level. There was a guy I met who was actually working for me for a time, and I said, wow. I looked at him one day, I said, those are terrific sideburns. I said, you can't even tell that you're bald. And he said, and he said to me, I'm not bald. I said, what are you talking about? Of course you're bald. I mean, his head looked like mine does now. And he said, I'm not. I said, you are. And he said to me, I'm not. And he actually believed, and people did because they were looking at, he said, when people see these sideburns, Graves, they don't see my baldness, right? Mm-hmm. So, do I look bald?
Now, what was it in the 70s and the 80s that was crucial to the magazine's growth?
First of all, we were chronicling the growth of business, the BE 100s, which became one of the most important things we did. We started that in 1973. First list, and the first list, Barry Gordy did $40 million and was at the top of the list. Johnson Publishing was right behind him. Today, if you look at that same list, the #1 company, Castle Wall, does $1.4 billion, and there are 3 companies on the list that do $1 billion, and so you can have that kind of growth. Now, I say that in one breath, but that's no short journey for the people who have accomplished it, and so that has become a standard, and that's an important part of what
was it hard to put the first list together, that first 100 list together?
Well, if you ever asked a brother or sister to tell you what they made, then that will answer your question. Yeah. But the answer was yes. But and imagine calling John Johnson, and I said, John, I'm going to need to know what you did. He said, right, Graves. And he said, now, what you are going to hear next is a click, right? And John, over the years, we became fast friends. But all he wanted to know was, what did the other guys do? Mm-hmm. And he was always satisfied in the position he was in, and that was the position he earned. We never compromised at all. There were people who lost as friends, and I don't think they really were friends because they didn't make the list. They weren't going to talk to us again, or they were going to stop doing business with us. And so those weren't friends to begin with.
You know, you've already anticipated the next question, which is about the multimedia enterprise. Let's take a look at this multimedia enterprise.
Today, Black Enterprise boasts a readership of 4.1 million and annual revenues topping $60 million. It is at the epicenter of today's business community. With Black Enterprise magazine as the anchor, the BE brand has evolved from a single title publication into a multimedia company. The brand's growing list of properties include 2 television programs, Our World with Black Enterprise and The Black Enterprise Report, a nationally syndicated radio series, Black Enterprise Magazine's Keys to a Better Life, business and career development conferences for entrepreneurs and women, lifestyle events, an award-winning website, and an interactive digital edition of Black Enterprise. After 35 years at the helm of this multimedia conglomerate, Graves turned the reins of leadership over to his oldest son, Butch, in January 2006, adding CEO to his president title. With over 60 honorary degrees and numerous honors to his name, Earl Graves remains committed to making a difference both inside and outside the corporate boardroom. He supported the release of imprisoned South African leader Nelson Mandela, protested the murder of African immigrant Amadou Diallo by the New York City Police, and launched the Black Wealth Initiative to help African Americans create multi-generational wealth. Graves serves on several corporate boards and contributes to countless causes.
It gives me a great pride to announce a pledge of $1 million to my alma mater, Morgan State.
He has always been the voice of reason.
All you're trying to do is guarantee of opportunity. That's what you're trying to get to. You're trying to get an opportunity to level the playing field so you can do this, have the chance to do it the same as everyone else does.
While nurturing the careers of many, he is known as a true family man. He and his wife Barbara have been married for 46 years and enjoy spending time with their 8 grandchildren. With their 3 sons running the business, Graves remains as chairman and publisher. His legacy lives on. For Earl Graves, Making a difference is what life is all about.
When you first started the magazine, I think you had two CEOs. 10 years ago, 2 CEOs. Today, you list more than 20. Look forward a bit. What's that number going to grow to?
The top is anywhere you want it to be, because the average shareholder just wants to know that you're driving the share price up. That's all they're interested in. Now, is there still racism out there? Absolutely.
But it could be overcome if you've got the goods.
Yes, obviously.
And obviously you had the goods. One of the goods that I think has been consistent through the magazine, both as a kind of hidden message and lately as an out front message, is wealth building. And you've got this Black Wealth Initiative. Tell us about that.
Well, my editors came to me, Alfred Edmond and Derek Dingle, and said, we need to go in a direction that's going to lead what this country needs to do, that we've got to say to people, that passing on your car payments when you die is not wealth sharing. That's not the answer. And so we need to do something different that's going to make a difference for people. And I said, well, what do you think we should do? He said, I think we need to talk about saving. We need to talk about home ownership. We need to talk about investing. And he said, and so therefore they came up with the Black Wealth Initiative, these 10 points. What is missing is that our parents taught us that we were supposed to save. And I worked for Western Union, making 75 cents an hour. I'd bring my envelope home unopened, give it to my father. He would give me what he thought I should get. Maybe it was $12 in the whole envelope for the week. And he would take a part that he would save for me, a part that he would, I quote, give to the house. And there was no argument. That was it. Now, and I must tell you, when I was working for him, I never just discussed the tips with him that I got, but that was, you know. But again, it was a discipline that he inculcated to us that is missing today. When Barbara and I have said to our sons growing up, we will help you if you have the right motives in terms of what you want. If they were to come to us and say, we need some assistance in buying a car, that's a very short conversation. But if they come to us and say, we want to improve something in our house, or we'd like some assistance, and I must say that most of it they have done themselves, but we want our sons and their friends and the daughters, and I must say the young women are doing an outstanding job. We need to touch on that before we close. In terms of the growth that you see that's happening in this country, and they are understanding what it is that our Black Wealth Initiative is saying. You've got to save, you've got to plan for the future. You know, your IRA is not going to do it without planning on what you're going to do and how you're going to do it.
Now, I'm sure many people in the audience want to know, you know, what the secret of your success is. We know it's hard work. We know you had an idea that no one else had had. But how did you become as successful as you have and still kept your family so closely around you? You know, you think about businesses, and minority, majority don't really care. Johnson Publishing is one that's done this, and Herman Russell has done it, and you've done it, passed on to the next generation, but so many don't. Why is that so, you think?
Well, first of all, again, a lot of credit has to be given to Barbara. We disagreed early on that we were going to spend the time with the kids irrespective of what I was doing. And so therefore, and you know, in Little League Baseball, that's like watching paint dry. But they were involved in sports, and I'd get home in time to the extent that I could, even when the magazine was in its embryonic stages, to see him play baseball, to see him play, or Johnny would do something, or Michael was doing something. So that happened.
How many of Butch's basketball games at Yale did you go to?
Butch and Johnny actually played against each other in college. Johnny was at Brown University and Butch was at Yale. And so I had a sweatshirt made where I bought a brown sweatshirt, cut it in half, and I bought a blue sweatshirt for Yale and cut that in half, had a housekeeper sew it together, and on one side it said Brown, on the other side it said Yale, and Barbara and I would sit right in the middle at half court, and no matter, we couldn't lose. No matter who won, we were. So we were very proud. And Michael was playing football at University of Pennsylvania as a nose tackle, and we'd go and see him, and Barbara always would say, as Michael went out on the field weighing 290 pounds, I hope my little boy doesn't get hurt, you know.
I think yesterday that Barbara has retired from the business 7 times.
Well, Barbara just said one day, she said, I think I'm going to retire. I said, you can't retire. And this was maybe, she worked at the company for 20 years, and this was, made an invaluable comment. When our CFO died, she became the CFO for 6 months, and things, you never knew there was a change. And so when she wanted to retire, I accepted that. But every time there was a crisis, we'd say, call Mom. And Barbara would come back. And so we brought her back innumerable times. We've cut that out now, because now I'm trying to stay home, and so that's working. But and when we have an outstanding staff of people today, you know, people who work for us have to come to work dressed like the way you and I are every day. We don't run a democracy. You have to dress like you're ready for business. If you come as an intern, you can't come with cornrows, because you go walking with cornrows to a major corporation, they're not going to tell you they didn't hire you because you're cornrows. You're just not going to get called back again. Now, you can make your statement if you want to, but I think you should make a statement by supporting the NAACP or help tutor some poor kid who needs tutoring, rather than try to hire you what your hairstyle is when you get to the job, and then they don't hire you.
Now, mentioning interns gives me a nice segue to another question. You said earlier today that you always have interns at Black Enterprise Magazine, but you described the gender difference in the applications that you get. What was that?
We had 500 applications last year for internships. We hire about 10 to 12, excuse me, Butch hires about 10 to 12 interns each year now. And this summer, and we had 500 applications, only 50 came from African-American men. All right. Now, but let me just say that's typical across the country, and it's an issue we clearly have to deal with. If you go in most African-American schools on the campus, in many instances, you will really think you're at a female college. At Howard University, we just graduated where 70% of the graduates were female. The incoming freshman class at Howard, where I've been a trustee for 20 years, again, had 69% of the students were female. At graduation, that number will be higher percentage-wise. So we have to ask ourselves, if the same students, female, are graduating from the same schools that the guys went to, assuming they finished, what is happening, and what is it that we're saying to the African-American young male is not allowing him to finish school and stay in school? And it's something we've just got to do something about. And it gets as basic as, and I've said this in a couple of speeches, that who's going to marry our daughters? You could, having a family and raising children is a very normal thing to want to do, and we've got to do something, not just to make it possible for African-American females to get married. I'm talking about the basis of our society going forward to it. In many instances, when I look back on segregation, we had to do it for ourselves, and we were better off in segregation because we were doing it for ourselves, right? Now, having been in jail several times because of segregation, you may or may not agree with that, but...
No, I understand exactly what you're saying, that all of us lived together in one community. We weren't separated as much by class then as we were now. And we had an economy of our own, which is small and struggling, but nonetheless there, and lots of that has disappeared now. So I understand exactly what you mean, but what can we do about it now? Facing these present-day realities, what can we do?
We need to do more to get African Americans to give. We can't assume that we got there or feel satisfied with the fact that we're there, and therefore don't look around us to see those who are in need. And that's something we have to do. And it's something that we do and try to do in leading, and we have to teach our children to do just that, and I believe that strongly.
Imagine you could do it all over again, and you couldn't do what you're doing now. What would you have done instead?
If I had it to do over, I think I would go to law school. I think the law touches everything, and I would say to the young men and women in the audience, if you're not sure what you want to do, the law will give you a basis for many, many things. There are many people in this room who are lawyers who are not practicing the law, but the ability they've gotten from the education from the law has made a difference to them in business.
Now, you spent your career in New York City. If you did it all over again, what would you do differently?
I'd start in the South.
Why the South?
Well, first of all, the opportunity is great. There's a whole bunch of people in New York like all of us. And there's a bunch of people like us in Atlanta and other major cities, Philadelphia, Chicago. Not a great baseball team in Chicago, but there's still a lot of good people.
They were with you, Earl. They were with you.
I couldn't help myself, I'm sorry. But in those cities, the opportunities are there. There are people who are doing well in those cities. We know that Xerox in Connecticut has African Americans at the top level. We know that Lloyd Trotter is the vice chairman of General Electric. And so that's there. But in the South, and when I say the South, I'm not talking about Birmingham. I'm talking about going to some city in the South that's named after some Civil War general, Confederate, and that you can't pronounce. That's the city you want to go to. The land is cheaper there. The life slows down. I did well in New York, but to an extent, the big cities are not for the faint of heart. I mean, you've got to be prepared to deal with it every day. You got to go and prepared to fight every day. The racism of trying to convince people to still advertise till this day. Butch gets the same kind of letters I used to get, and Johnny gets it, and Michael gets it, and our staff gets them. We are just so good at what we do that we overcome that and keep on marching.
And here's one which I imagine will be difficult for you, not because you can't answer it, but because sometimes it's hard to be introspective and self-examining. What do you want your legacy to be?
I want my legacy to be that my family was most important. I try very hard for my grandchildren to know that I love them very, very much. I tell them that their reputation is the only thing that they have, and if they screw that up, there's no place to go, right? And I try to inculcate that to other youngsters also. None of us know how long we have down here on this earth, but I want Barbara to know I love her more and more each day in terms of the time we have. And I'd like people to be able to say that I made a difference in terms of education, that I made a difference in terms of my extended family, who I love dearly. And again, I need to say that whatever legacy I have, I think Barbara has played an enormous role in backing me and being with me and alongside of me too.
Earl, this is a remarkable story, and I'm so happy you shared it with everyone here and with me, and we've been close for all these years. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for sharing this story with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Earl Graves.
Till he comes, sing out to my Jesus. Oh, my Jesus, 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 till he comes. Oh, yeah, my Lord, oh, yeah, my Lord, oh, yeah, my Lord. Hallelujah. I'm gonna pray to my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, to my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, to my Jesus, till he comes. Pray to my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, to my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, to my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, to my Jesus. Can't you feel the Spirit move? Can't you feel it moving? Can't you feel it moving? Can't you feel it moving? I'm gonna shout out to my Jesus, oh my Jesus, oh to 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 my Jesus. Till he comes, I'm gonna shout, oh my Jesus, oh my Jesus, oh my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, till he comes. Oh, Elijah, oh, Elijah, oh, Elijah rock, Elijah, oh, Elijah, Elijah rock, Elijah, oh, Elijah, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, oh, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, oh. Come on, sister, help me to pray. Tell me my Lord done pass his way. Elijah rock, oh, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, oh, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, shout, shout, Elijah rock, come and out the Lord, Elijah rock, shout, shout, Elijah rock, come and out the Lord. Elijah rock, shout, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, Elijah rock, shout, shout, Elijah rock, come and out the Lord, Elijah rock, shout, shout, Elijah rock, come and out the Lord. Satan ain't nothing but a snake in the grass. He's a conjurer, he's a liar. Hallelujah, Lord. Elijah rock, 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 shout, shout, Elijah rock, come and out the Lord, Elijah rock, shout, shout, Elijah rock, come and out the Lord. Elijah rock. If I could, I surely would stand on the rock.
For more information or to order your own copy of An Evening with Earl Graves, please visit thehistorymakers.org or call 866-914-1900. That's 866-914-1900. The preceding program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org. The following program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org. From a young boy raised in the Bronx to one of the greatest military leaders of our day, Colin Powell is an American success story. The History Makers, the nation's largest African-American video oral history archive, is proud to present An Evening with Colin Powell. And now to our host, renowned journalist, Juan Williams.
The art of autobiography is at the heart of the History Makers Project. Tonight, we will all have the pleasure to hear from a man whose autobiography has sold more than 2 million copies. The story of Colin Powell. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Colin Powell. Please have a seat. Good evening. General Powell, thank you so much for being here this evening. You honor us with your presence.
Thank you very much, Juan, and I'd like to express my thanks to the History Makers and to Julieanna for bringing us all together this evening on this important occasion.
Now, I don't want to divulge anything too secret, but I hear you just had a birthday. Happy birthday.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm one short of 70 now.
One short?
Yeah.
Well, don't think of it that way. To me, you're looking good.
I'm looking forward to 70.
Why?
Because I'll still be here.
You know, I remember when I first met you, you were President Reagan's national security advisor. And what had caught my attention was a picture of President Reagan, Soviet leader Gorbachev, having a meeting up in New York City. And there were you, an African-American at a table with these world leaders.
I remember vividly, it was at Governor's Island in New York Harbor, and it was just a few weeks before President Reagan was to leave office and Gorbachev came to see him. And they had done so much together to create conditions that were bringing the Cold War to an end. And I had worked very closely, not only with President Reagan, but with President Gorbachev. So to be there at that magic moment, when Gorbachev was still trying to control something that couldn't be controlled, still trying to preserve something that couldn't be preserved, the Soviet Union. And so it was a privilege to be at that meeting, and a privilege to have been with President Reagan for the 2 years that I was.
The other thing that so impressed me about you was that you're a man who's able to speak Yiddish, Jamaican accent, Southern accent, British accent, Jamaican. I mean, it doesn't stop. You can do it all.
Well, it's a product of the environment in which I grew up in the South Bronx section of New York City, where everybody was a minority of one kind or another. Eastern European, Jewish, Puerto Rican, American blacks from the South, Jamaicans, and all kinds of other West Indians. And so I picked up a little of each of that.
Now you're on the speaker circuit, you're participating in new business adventures. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to be Colin Powell, private citizen?
Well, it's very refreshing. It's the second time I've retired. And it's really nice to get back to being normal and not to be surrounded by people, to be able to drive yourself. The only real disadvantage is that instead of my 757, I now have the Delta Shuttle. I always have enjoyed going into retirement. In this case, I'm back in the speaking circuit, but I'm also involved in a number of business interests and some nonprofit work.
You know, one of the things that we've had in common since we've known each other is a great love of African-American history. And I wonder if you would share with us a little bit about African-American military history. And here I'm thinking of names like Henry O. Flipper, I'm thinking of the 10th Cavalry, I'm thinking of the Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers, of course, you've been involved so much with that monument out at Fort Leavenworth. But when you hear these names, how do they fit into the Colin Powell story?
Black military history is a rich history, and it's not that well known. It goes back 300 years. Blacks were always brought into military service when there was a need for additional bodies and blood. But when the conflict was over, then blacks were sent back into servitude. And it was the case in the Revolutionary War, where Washington had a number of blacks serving under him. It was the case in the War of 1812, when black men were promised their freedom and property if they fought for their country. They didn't receive that, but nevertheless, they fought. And every war we've ever been in, blacks stepped forward because it was the one place they could demonstrate equality. They weren't slaves, they weren't being oppressed. They may be in segregated units, and they may not have gotten the same pay or rations or equipment as white soldiers, but nevertheless, they were able to show that they were as brave and courageous as any other group of Americans. And they also knew that every time they did that, they would put the lie to racial discrimination to the test. With every step forward, they knew there would be progress. And it was really after the Civil War when, for the first time, blacks were allowed to remain in the military, not in the immediate time of war. And they created those 4 regiments, 2 cavalry and 2 infantry, and some of them were at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And when I went there as a brigadier general, maybe almost 100 years later, there still was no monument to them. There's a monument to Sherman and all of the other great generals of our time, and I said, where is the monument to the black soldiers that were here? It took us years, but we put that monument up. And I'm very proud of it because those black soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers as they were known, wore the same blue uniform as a white soldier. They had brass buttons. They carried a weapon, and they had US on their collars, and they were every bit the American as their white counterparts. In fact, the Confederates started to recruit blacks, and a Confederate general wrote to Jefferson Davis and said, "Don't do it. Use blacks for whatever purposes you may find them useful, digging ditches, chopping trees, cooking food, doing laundry, but do not make them soldiers, because if a black man can be a soldier for the Confederacy, then the Confederacy is living a lie, and our whole theory of slavery is wrong." And he was right, it was wrong. And when a black man put on the uniform and showed that he could fight, then no question in due course he would receive equality. It took another 100 years. We had to go through the Tuskegee Airmen. We had to go through the Montford Point Marines when the Marines were finally integrated. We had to go through the Golden 13 in the Navy. Officers were finally allowed into the Navy. We had to do all of those things to reach the point that we have reached now, where the military is the most integrated institution in American society and has shown the rest of society what you can do when you give everybody an opportunity to move up based on performance. And when, yes, you do use some affirmative action, as we have over time, to redress the grievances of the past. And Exhibit A is not just myself, but all the generals who are sitting here tonight who came through that process.
In fact, Frederick Douglass made that point when he argued with President Lincoln that black people should be allowed to fight in the Union.
He fought for it. And as a result of Frederick Douglass's lobbying for it, it happened, and hundreds of thousands of blacks served during the Civil War.
You're growing up in the Bronx with your mom and dad, Maud, who was a seamstress, and I've read where she used to put together those tickets on Thursday nights so she could get paid on Friday. And then piecework. And then your dad, now your dad was only 5'3", you've told me.
He was at best 5'3", and Mom was about 5'1".
Really?
We don't need to go there, Juan.
Oh, no, don't be nervous. Don't get nervous.
They were two short people. And the family story is that I take after an aunt, a very distant aunt. And therefore, I was a little taller than the rest of them. But they were two remarkable people, two very, very strong people. And everybody asks me, who are your role models? And it was these two people. But it was more than just them. I lived in a neighborhood that could best be described as a village or a tribe. It really was a tribal setup in the South Bronx section of New York, with aunts and uncles and extended family of cousins, and with neighbors and the tradespeople and the priests at our Episcopal church and the teachers in the public schools. All of us living in this little compressed.
Now this is Kelly Street.
Kelly Street, South Bronx section.
And you go to PS 20.
PS 20, PS 39, PS 52, Morris High School.
And you describe this neighborhood as such a polyglot. But did people get along?
Yeah, they got along. It's not to say that it was perfect. I mean, it was a tenement neighborhood, and we all had to put bars on the windows and bars behind the door, and drugs had started to really come into the neighborhood at that time. But it had not yet reached that tipping point, and it was a nice family upbringing. And the big thing that I remember most vividly than anything else is the way in which all of these adults, aunts, uncles, cousins, and teachers and priests and everyone else kept the kids in play. We were not allowed to fail. It was unacceptable for anybody in my extended family to be a failure. Didn't mean you had to be a general or a doctor or a lawyer. In fact, that was the furthest thing from my mind when I was a kid in New York City. But you had to stay in school, and you had to do well, and you had to meet our expectations. We didn't come to this country for the next generation to blow it. As long as you did well, took care of your family, and as long as you didn't shame the family in any way, then this is what was expected of you. So we were never asked if we wanted to go to school. We were never asked if we wanted to go to college. It was expected. That's all there was to it.
Now, you've described a strong Jamaican family. Let's take a look.
They were like other immigrants to America, coming in search of a better life. It was 1920, and Colin Powell's father, Luther Powell, came on a banana boat from Jamaica to New York. Luther would meet his future bride, Maud, while renting a room in her mother's home. They would marry and start a family. Their first child, Marilyn, would be followed by the birth of a son. Alice Graham McCoy watched Colin and Marilyn while their parents worked in New York's Garment District. The Powells would then move to Hunts Point, New York, to a neighborhood known as Banana Kelly. Here, life centered around the neighborhood, Jamaican food and culture, calypso music, St. Margaret's Episcopal Church, and home. Colin would graduate from Moores High School at age 17 and enroll at City College of New York. Here, the ROTC caught his attention. Colin came under the tutelage of Ronald "Ronnie" Brooks, his role model and friend. It was here as a member of the Pershing Rifles that the seeds of Colin Powell, the soldier, would be born.
So what was it about the Pershing Rifles that caught your attention?
I entered college at age 17 and went into engineering because my parents said that's where the money is, go into engineering. And no skill or aptitude for it, and so that lasted about 6 months.
I think you once told me a story about someone asking you to visualize the intersection.
Visualize a plane intersecting a cone in space. And I said, I can't do it. And the next thing you know, I was majoring in geology. But I was majoring in geology just because they wouldn't let me drop out. And I didn't have any interest in geology either. But about that time, I discovered ROTC. And I discovered this group within ROTC, the Pershing Rifles, that were quite elite. And that caught my fancy. I like the discipline, I like the uniforms, I like the sense of purpose, the sense of mission that they had, and I like the camaraderie. And I found I was pretty good at it. I give this story to youngsters all the time. Find out that what you're good at and what you love doing, and that's what you ought to be doing. So that's what I found in the Army.
What did your dad think of this? Because from the way you describe him, I think of him as a disciplinarian.
No, they pretty much knew that you would do the right thing if they guided you. So there wasn't stern discipline, but it was sort of family expectations that created the discipline.
So no anger over what happened with engineering?
No, they were disappointed, but they weren't angry. They got a little uneasy, though, when my interest went entirely in the direction of the Army. Nobody in the family had ever gone in the Army and stayed in the Army. And it looked like I was heading in that direction. But nevertheless, they were proud that I was staying in college. And 4.5 years after I began, I graduated with my Bachelor of Science in Geology and my commission to go in the Army.
Now, during this time, you went to, I think in '57, it's Fort Bragg, and for summer training, and then later you go for infantry training to Fort Benning. So what was the first experience like at Fort Bragg, the summer training?
Well, Fort Bragg, I took the bus at the New York Port Authority bus terminal, and my father was standing on the side looking at me through the window of the bus as I headed off to North Carolina. And he swore he would never see me again. Nevertheless, I got there okay, and then driving back, I drove back with a couple of sergeants from my ROTC detachment, members of the cadre. And I learned what it was like being in the South. Fort Bragg itself was okay, but we weren't ignorant of what the South was like. And so we drove straight through, as you used to do in those days, and we hit all of the gas stations with the 3 restrooms, white men, white women, and blacks, whatever they put over the top. Had lots of names for us in those days. And I knew that this wasn't something I could ever be happy about. I was disappointed and mad that these kinds of things happened in the country that I was getting ready to serve. But once I got back to New York, things were fine. But I was also told by my commanders that, you just do the best job you can. Don't try to change the society in the South. They were essentially saying, be a good soldier and let things change as you go forward. So they wanted me to do well, but they also wanted to make sure that I understood the social circumstances in which I was serving. But it wasn't always easy, especially after I got into the Army, and Al and I took our first trip south as a married couple in 1962, shortly after we were married. And, Alma was expecting Mike, and you had to just keep driving. You didn't stop. Some people forget that there were only 2 black motels on the north-south roads in those days. And if you couldn't get to one of them, you better have a relative and a lot of chicken in the back of the car.
And infantry training? What was that like? Now, is
Infantry training,
that segregated?
No. The Army was completely integrated. In fact, an interesting story here is that if I had come in 10 years earlier, or if any of the generals here this evening had come in 10 years earlier, we never would have become generals. We sort of cut or caught the post-Truman desegregation era. Truman did it as an executive order in 1948. He integrated the military. He did it as an executive order because he never would have gotten it through Congress to change the law. But it took another 5 years for the services to truly desegregate, and they did it under the pressure of the Korean War. Most of us here tonight came in that early 50s to mid to late 50s period, when the Army looked itself squarely in the face and said, we have to do what we have been told to do, and we have to do everything we can to correct for past discrimination. As a result of that, all of us were able to be judged on the basis of our performance.
So the bus that you rode down for the summer group and for infantry training, was that an integrated group or a segregated group that rode down?
No, when you go into the South, then it was segregated.
Okay.
But coming back, of course, I drove in private cars, and that was integrated as long as you didn't try to go and eat anywhere.
And was it difficult to get into that infantry training?
No. The infantry training for me didn't turn out to be that difficult because I was well prepared for it. And I discovered that I'd picked up a pretty good education in the public school system of New York, and I could compete from the very beginning with West Pointers and others from better schools. And in the infantry school, Fort Benning, Georgia, the only color they recognize is green. Infantry, and green and blue. Infantry color being blue and green being your uniform. And that's the only thing that mattered to them. And if you performed, we'll move you on. If you don't perform, we don't care what color you are.
So you're in the Army now. Germany is your first stop. So let's take a look.
Colin Powell's first assignment was Gelnhausen, Germany, a base 20 miles east of Frankfurt and a place he would return to twice again during his career. Basic training was followed by his promotion to first lieutenant and then again to captain. It was 1962, and Colin Powell would go on a blind date that would change his life. He met Alma Johnson, who was from a distinguished family of educators in Birmingham, Alabama. Their attraction was immediate, and by August, they were married. Stationed at Fort Bragg, they settled into base life, only to have Colin transferred to Saigon on Christmas Day. An injury won Colin Powell a Purple Heart. Joining his wife and newborn son Michael, Powell returned to a country in the midst of racial unrest. Birmingham was caught in the eye of a storm. 4 little girls killed at 16th Baptist Church, police dogs, civil unrest, and turmoil. All of this happening while black soldiers fought for their country in Vietnam. During Colin Powell's second tour of duty in Vietnam, he saved fellow soldiers' lives in a helicopter crash. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1969, and Colin Powell returned to the United States. Settling in D.C., he entered business school at George Washington University, graduated, and in 1971 became a White House Fellow. Here, Colin Powell began his Washington years.
Now, a moment ago we were talking about driving south with your wife, Alma. But it would be interesting, I think, for everybody to hear how you met Alma Powell.
Met her on a blind date. A friend of mine was interested in her roommate. She was living in Boston, going to Emerson College to get her master's degree in audiology. And so my friend, Mike Henningberg, was interested in her roommate, and I was brought along to conduct a pickoff play.
The wingman, as they say.
The wingman, yeah. And I don't think Mike ever saw the girl again. But Alma and I found each other.
Well, what was it like? What did you say to her?
Well, we...
Please, baby, please?
You really... No, you really ought to have her tell a story, because she tells it better than I do. But she apparently fussed at her roommate for setting this all up. And she said, I don't date soldiers. And her father would not have approved. But when I came through the door, she says, I looked so young and whatever. That she ran back into the room and put on some makeup and straightened herself up. We were married about 9 months later.
Well, one of the things that I read about Mrs. Powell is that she said she was meeting people who wanted to avoid military service, and here comes this young man who says that he wants to be in the military for a career.
Yeah, that was Boston, you may recall. And there were a lot of people then who, were avoiding, you try to not get drafted, and you certainly didn't volunteer for service, and here I come. I'm not from Birmingham, I'm not from Boston, I'm from New York, and I'm stationed at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, nearby, and I walk in, and it's not anything she ever expected, but it worked, it clicked.
Now, as in the video we just saw, there was mention of the fact that you were in Vietnam when your first son, Michael, when your only son, Michael, was born.
Yeah, I was in the jungle along the Laotian border. I was an advisor to a Vietnamese infantry battalion, and Michael was born, and we had a system set up where I was supposed to get a notification through Red Cross, because we were way out in the jungle, and we could get on the radio maybe once every 3 days or so. And nothing came, and suddenly a little airplane came over and dropped out some mail to us. We recovered it in the jungle, and there was a letter from my mother. And she was telling me all the news of the family, and at the very end of the letter, she said, oh, by the way, we're so happy about the baby. And what baby? And so we got on the radio, radioed back to the base, and they had a letter from Alma waiting, and Michael had been born a couple of weeks earlier, but it was another 7 months before I saw him for the first time.
Now, we also saw in the video images of Birmingham, her hometown, which was going through such turmoil with the Civil Rights era, and then we saw a mention of the '68 assassination of Dr. King. Now, you're in Vietnam during this period.
Yeah. This 10-year period, roughly, is, I consider one of the most difficult periods in our national history. We were going through the second Civil War, first one in the 1860s, force of arms. And this time, we were going to do it peacefully, but we had to finally win rights for all Americans, especially African Americans. And it came at a time when we lost a president, President Kennedy. We had race riots, we had anti-war riots in the country, and then, as noted in the video, we lost Martin Luther King in April of 1968. We lost Bobby Kennedy, and a few years later, we lost the president and the vice president who had to resign in disgrace. I can tell you the Russians and the Chinese in those days thought, see, we told you, this place is going to fall apart. But we came through it because of the resiliency of our society and the fact that we have a constitutional system and that the people ultimately make the choices. But it really was a tough time, especially in the South. Alma stayed with her parents in Birmingham when I went to Vietnam the first time. She stayed the second time as well. And while I was walking in that jungle along the Laotian border, my father-in-law was standing guard with a shotgun at his house in Birmingham when the riots were taking place in 1963. I didn't know all of that. I really didn't understand all of that until I got back after being away for a whole year and seeing the turmoil that the country was in. But then we also had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I was able, the day after it was signed on July 4th, to go back to the hamburger joint in Fort Benning, Georgia, just outside Columbus, Georgia, the same hamburger joint that had refused to serve me 6 months earlier when I had just gotten back from Vietnam, and all I wanted was a hamburger.
Were you in uniform when they refused?
No, but they knew who I was. In fact, I was trying to set up a home in the Columbus area to bring Alma down from Birmingham with our infant son, Mike, and I was just on the way back to the base and just pulled in for a hamburger, and it was a nice young lady, but she said she couldn't serve me. She tried to help. She said, are you an African student?
You should have told her you were a prince.
It might have worked. I said, no, but she said, are you Puerto Rican? No. Are you an African student from one of the African countries serving at Fort Benning? I said, no. She said, oh, I said, yes. And she said, well, I'm sorry, I'm from New Jersey and I don't understand all of this, but I can't serve you. you'll have to go around the back to get your hamburger. I said, no, thanks. And I left. But I went back on about July 5th or 6th of the following year, right after the Civil Rights Bill was signed. And they served me with delight. And they needed that. They needed the law. They needed the law of the land so they could start to change hearts and minds. And we have come a long way in the last 40 years since those days, but we still have a long way to go.
Let's go back to Vietnam. We know about the turmoil here, but you're saying among the white and black soldiers there, you didn't feel the tensions?
There was tension. The Army is a reflection of the society in every manifestation of that. And so the racial problems in the United States affected the troops overseas. But because of their shared sacrifice and the need to work together, they were still able to work together as a proud force. And those young men and women who served over there, either as volunteers or draftees, did a great job for America, even though ultimately Vietnam fell. But now, 30 years later, we are once again friends with Vietnam.
And you would hear news of Malcolm X, Dr. King. Did any of that come through to you as a soldier?
Very little of it. Some of it came through, but we were far away, and this is long before the days of the internet and live television and cable channels. But we were not unaware of these things, and we were kind of torn because we were in the military. We followed orders. We were agents of the state, the power of the state, and yet there was this turmoil. There's a Dr. King in his peaceful ways or more militant ways, such as Stokely and some of the others advocated. As I think back on that period, I think we needed both. We needed Dr. King with his message of peace and reconciliation, but we also needed some strong-willed individuals who pointed out to the rest of the country that you have to find a way forward now because the militancy could take over. And we found our way through that.
Were there many black officers in Vietnam?
Yes. In the 60s, we really started to have an infusion of black officers. And in our staff colleges and our war colleges, more and more black lieutenant colonels and colonels were being selected. Because the Army realized if you're going to have an Army that could be as high as 30% black, and it hit those numbers, it's much lower now, then you had better have an officer corps that reflects that and reflects the diversity of the country. And that's why the Army works so hard for diversity, for affirmative action, in order to show that the Army looked like the society that it reflected.
Well, in fact, now, when you're back at one point, I believe at Fort Leavenworth, you asked to go to graduate school and you're told that your grades aren't good enough.
Well, yeah, they were right. I mean, they weren't good enough. But nevertheless, I was doing well in the Army. And the officer who was giving me counseling said, you know, your grades from CCNY just aren't strong enough to get you into graduate school. Sorry. But I pressed it. And so I took the graduate records exam and got into this university, George Washington University. And when I arrived to get my Master's of Business Administration, I had 18 months. And my guidance counselor here, Professor McCarthy, took one look at my undergraduate record and he said, you can't do it in less than 2 years. You're not very smart. And so sitting in his office, he called the Army and said, he looks like a great officer, but you got to give him 2 years and a couple of summer schools. And the Army agreed. And it took a full 2 years, and McCarthy was right. But I graduated from this wonderful university with an A average, and Dr. Trachtenberg is here now, so I don't want to embarrass him. Learned a great deal here.
You know what I was actually thinking about when I asked the question was the fact that you graduated second in your class at the General Staff College.
Right.
And that's what got the attention of people in the military.
Yeah. By time I got to staff college or got ready for graduate school, some habits of discipline had kicked in, and the Army had taught me enough about hard work and studying, and I had a family to take care of, that I couldn't fool around like I did in undergraduate.
So if you're talking to a kid today who's
Don't
thinking...
follow me.
Well, I know, but let's take the good part of the story.
Family. My family hated when I wrote in the book that I was such a bad student. But it's true. I have the records. I got the transcripts. And
we trust you. We trust you.
No, it's true.
But so how do you go from being a guy who's a bad student to a guy who's suddenly second in officers' club?
I had to work very hard, I had to study very hard, and I had to put in extra effort, which is what I tell young people now. That there's no substitute for putting in the work, making the effort, and believing in yourself, and just going after it. And those are traits that I learned in the Army.
Well, then after you graduate from GW, this is 1969?
71.
71. What'd you do next?
Went to the Army back to the Army staff for a while, waiting to see what would come along next. And then the Army told me to apply to be a White House Fellow. And I applied and was selected to be a White House Fellow, which started me in my political career, such as it was then. And I worked in the Office of Management and Budget as deputy in the Deputy Director's Office.
Caspar Weinberger?
Caspar Weinberger initially and Frank Carlucci initially. They became great friends and mentors over the years. We just lost Mr. Weinberger recently. But they went over to HHS, or then HEW, to run it for President Nixon. And I worked for Fred Malek for 9 months.
Well, what was the experience as a White House Fellow? Did they give you serious responsibility, or were you treated as this military guy?
A lot of the time was spent meeting cabinet officers, meeting all kinds of people in Washington. So I learned the Washington scene quite well. And they also allowed us to travel. And in 1972 and 73, I was able to go to the Soviet Union and cross the Soviet Union from the East Coast in Siberia, taking the Trans-Siberian Express for 3 days and then flying to Moscow. And that was an unusual thing for an Army lieutenant colonel in those days. And then the next summer in 73, before I went back to the Army, I went to China for 3 weeks. And I was one of the first Army officers allowed into China since the revolution in 1949. So at that point in my career, I had seen the two great communist giants that I was preparing to fight at some point in the future, if that ever came to pass. So it was quite an educational experience.
Well, why did they give you permission to go?
Because they thought the White House Fellows was an important program. They didn't know they were also going to get a couple infantry officers to go along with the program. But once they realized we were infantry officers, I can assure you they kept a very close watch on us.
You go from working in your career from President Carter to President Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
What happened there?
Well, I've worked for lots of presidents. I mean, I've worked for the last 6, I guess. But I was a White House Fellow under Nixon. And then I was a colonel under President Carter and did some work on the Panama Canal treaties, but got back out into the Army, which is where I wanted to be, and was brigade commander in the 101st Airborne Division. But then found myself back in Washington toward the tail end of the Carter administration, working for then Secretary of Defense Harold Brown. And then Reagan came in, and I went to work for Frank Carlucci and Weinberger again.
And shifting from one party to another, no problem?
I was never in a party, if you mean political party. In those days, I was a professional soldier and had no party affiliation and never expressed any political affiliation whatsoever. In fact, as Reagan's national security advisor, I was a 3-star general. And nobody in the White House dared ask me what party I might be in.
Now, around this time, you got involved in a remarkable project that we talked about earlier, the creation of the Buffalo Soldiers Monument. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was just a simple case that at Fort Leavenworth, which is one of our most historic posts and one of our oldest posts, everyone who'd ever served there had been memorialized. And I was walking around the post, and I never saw anything that recognized the black soldiers that were there. And finally, the historian said, oh, no, there are 2 streets down by the cemetery. So I went to look for these 2 streets, 9th and 10th Cavalry Avenue. And they turned out to be 2 unpaved roads going through an abandoned trailer park. So I went back to my headquarters. I was a brigadier general. And I called in the historian. And I said, that is not going to make it. And so you need to put your thinking cap on, because I want to see an equestrian statue with a buffalo soldier on it, erected on a prominent place in this post, on this post. And it took years. I left and others followed and continued the work, but I was very honored to go back and dedicate the statue some 8 or 9 years later. It's one of the major tourist landmarks in eastern Kansas.
Your career was still on a fast track, so let's take a look.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
By 1986, the politics of the nation had changed, and Colin Powell was appointed Deputy Assistant to President Ronald Reagan. This appointment forced him to leave Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and return to Washington, D.C. By November of 1987, General Powell made history when President Ronald Reagan appointed him National Security Advisor. This was the time of Iran-Contra, the Persian Gulf conflict, Panama, and Noriega. Powell traveled around the world. By 1989, he became Commander-in-Chief of Forces Command, responsible for 1 million troops and all U.S. Army field forces. Colin Powell entered a significant period in his career.
I am most pleased to introduce the man that I have selected to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin L. Powell.
His appointment was historic.
Very pleased to be joining your national security team. I look forward to working with you, the Vice President, and all the members of the team as you face the historic opportunities and challenges that are before us.
Now a 4-star general and the 12th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Powell would become the soldier of soldiers.
Now, you're the youngest, but you're also the first ROTC man ever to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
That's right.
Tell me a story. Did the whole ROTC explode in joy?
ROTC, yes, they did, matter of fact. Previously, it was expected that West Pointers or Academy graduates would ascend to that. But I was the first ROTC graduate to become chairman, but there were 2 other chairmen who had direct commissions or OCS. So I wasn't the first non-West Pointer, there were others. But it was an extremely proud moment for me and for the ROTC program.
Now, you had 28, I think is the way we've counted them up for History Makers, 28 crises that you dealt with during this time. Does one story stand out in your mind?
Desert Shield and Desert Storm, perhaps, is the one that stands out uppermost in my mind. The whole nation was watching this. It was the first televised war. Not to offend you, but it was the first CNN war. I say that in a generic sense, not a particular network. But it's the first thing that was ever covered like that. And it was also the first time the American people got to see this professional, all-volunteer force at work. And the most technical war anyone had ever seen, with cruise missiles and GPS systems and all sorts of other things that we were using, stealth fighters. And a lot was on the line. Presidency was on the line. And we said to President Bush that if we can't avoid war, we've got to do it with enough force to get it done right. And we did, and we accomplished the mission which was assigned, which was to kick the Iraqi army out of Kuwait.
Now, you're in private life. What made you decide to write the memoirs? And you throw a second part to that question, which is you also then found America's Promise. What were you trying to accomplish with that?
Well, the book was something that I was anxious to do. I didn't really think about writing a book until some people said, you really owe this to your family and you owe it to the American people to kind of describe your life. And so I found that to be an exciting experience once it was over. Like, you're the master of this, so not me. But then after the book was out and I decided not to enter political life, we were looking around for things to do. We were quite busy, but looking for something else to do. And President Clinton came to me and we talked about having a summit for America's young people, where we bring all the living presidents together and launch a campaign. Mrs. Reagan represented President Reagan. He was suffering too badly from Alzheimer's by then. And so we created America's Promise from that summit.
Well, let's go now from the personal back to the professional, because your career in government wasn't over. So let's take a look at this.
In January 2001, General Colin Powell again made history when he was appointed by President George W. Bush as the first African-American Secretary of State.
Pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I am honored to be given the opportunity to return to public service as the 65th Secretary of State of the United States of America.
9 months later, America would be thrown into chaos because of the events of September 11th. In time, Secretary of State Powell would advocate a more deliberate, consensus-building approach. This approach was criticized by those advocating a more aggressive military response. Secretary Powell called himself a reluctant warrior.
The terrorist threat is global in scope, many-faceted and determined. The campaign against terrorism must be equally comprehensive, multidimensional, and steadfast.
He attempted to assemble an international coalition, and oftentimes he was the lone voice of moderation as Americans struggled to understand September 11th and its aftermath. War was raged on bin Laden, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan led to a war on Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Powell stayed the course. After the re-election of President George W. Bush, Powell decided to return to private life.
It has been my great honor and privilege to have been once again given the opportunity to serve my nation. And I will always treasure the 4 years that I have spent with President Bush and with the wonderful men and women of the Department of State. I think we've accomplished a great deal.
Condoleezza Rice replaced him, accomplishing yet another first: consecutive African-American secretaries of state.
I think there are still challenges out there, but I think there are far more opportunities out there.
General Colin Powell, a loyal servant and eloquent spokesman. The son of Jamaican parentage, this soldier of the highest order, this public servant who has risen to the highest ranks of American government, was now entering the next chapter in his life.
Have you ever thought what your time as Secretary of State would have been like without 9/11?
Sure. I mean, 9/11 was a defining moment, and it came 9 months into the administration. We were just starting to get our sea legs. We were beginning to engage with the Russian Federation on reducing more nuclear weapons. We were just getting over an incident with the Chinese. Remember when our two planes crashed, which could have blown up the relationship, but didn't. And so things were moving in the right direction. And then 9/11 came along, and we found that America had to respond to this new enemy that had infiltrated into our country and caused such a terrible disaster. And the first thing to do was to go after Al-Qaeda where they were, which was in Afghanistan. And so that's what we did, and we quickly took out the Taliban. And now, several years later, we see that Afghanistan has a freely elected government, a freely elected president. Women are back in civil society. Girls are going to school. The job is not yet done, but we should be very proud of what we did in Afghanistan. Iraq came along, and I always try to avoid war. I've always been called a reluctant warrior, and more power to those who call me such, because I think war should always be a last resort. And I recommended that we take it to the United Nations first, and we did. And we tried to see if we could find a solution, but it was not forthcoming. President Bush and a number of other leaders decided that military force was appropriate, and I supported that. I would have supported a peaceful solution and hoped for a peaceful solution. But when that didn't happen, war came, and I supported using military force. And I'm glad that Saddam Hussein is no longer the president of Iraq, and he's standing in the dock. And I'm glad the Iraqi people now have the opportunity to select their own leaders and decide how they will be governed, and they have a constitution. It's going to be difficult to bring all of this about in a democratic way. They are under enormous pressure from insurgents, from terrorists, and now there's a danger of sect-on-sect violence. It is increasingly in the hands of the Iraqis to work this out. They are now sovereignty. They have their own sovereign government. And we're going to have to stand with them, but increasingly the burden is going to be on their military and security forces and going to be on their political system.
Now, in the clip that we just saw, we saw you giving testimony, if you will, before the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And you were making the case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. And you had George Tenet, the CIA director, seated right behind you. Later, it turned out that some of that was not right, not true.
It was, some of it was wrong. The information with respect to his intentions, his
capability to have such weapons and his history of having used such weapons. I've been to the town in northern Iraq where he killed 5,000 people one Friday morning in 1988 with nerve gas. Even though he had intention and capability, he didn't actually have the stockpiles that we thought he had and we said he had. And that was a failure of the intelligence community. But it was what we all believed at the time. And it is what the Senate and the House believed when they passed a resolution 4 months before my presentation. And in the previous administration, President Clinton had to face similar kinds of issues in 1998 when his intelligence folks were telling him that this was a real danger. And he undertook Operation Desert Fox, a 4-day bombing campaign against those kinds of targets.
Now, during this period, there are lots of reports about difficulties between you and some people who had been your patrons. For example, Vice President Cheney, the very man who had recommended you to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, now as vice president, has a very different point of view about the war effort. Donald Rumsfeld, another person that you'd worked with closely before, different points of view, lots of contention as you go to the president. What about these reports, and does that lead you to decide that you don't want to stay on for a second term?
There were serious debates about all of these issues because these are issues of enormous importance. In most issues, we had agreement, whether it was dealing with the Russians or dealing with the Chinese, sending troops into Liberia to help the African Union get Charles Taylor out, keeping our troops in the Balkans as opposed to bringing them out. All of these are difficult issues, and they were all debated. With respect to Afghanistan, there was no disagreement. We might have disagreed about, what mixed force to send in, but it was successful. The big issue that everybody talks about is Iraq. And I went to the president and said he should try a diplomatic solution. Now, some of my other colleagues didn't think a diplomatic solution would work, didn't think that the UN would be able to deal with this. But nevertheless, the president accepted my recommendation, and the others joined in once it was clear that this is the better way to go. And so we went unanimously with a presentation to the United Nations by the president in September of 2002. So there were debates, there were disagreements. They can't cover it up. We had strong differences of view on different issues. But I'm not the president. Mr. Cheney isn't the president. Mr. Rumsfeld isn't the president. The president heard all of these different points of view, and he is the one who made the decisions. And our jobs, myself, Don, Condi, the vice president, our responsibility was to give the president our best advice in the strongest terms we could, and that's what we did.
Well, is that why you're not in the administration any longer?
I thought 4 years was enough, and I thought that toward the end there were sufficiently strong views that were so differing in moving forward that it'd be better if I ended at the end of one term. And I said to the president I thought it'd be best if I left after one term, and we left on very good standing with each other.
Yes or no? So if the president or anyone else comes back in the future and says, what about Secretary of Defense? What does Colin Powell say?
Well, Juan, you learn in this business never to answer the hypothetical.
Now, tell me about your legacy. When people are watching this tape in the future, someday when you won't be with us, maybe I won't be here as well, but what do you want people to think about Colin Powell? What's the legacy?
I'm pretty much now what I think I was at the beginning of all of this 50 almost years ago. The one who captures it best is my youngest child, Anne-Marie. And she got asked not too long ago, what was it like growing up with Colin Powell as your father? And she just looks at them, and she's a bit of a smarty. And she said, well, he wasn't Colin Powell then. And the point is, don't take yourself too seriously. And I've been a national security advisor, I've been a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I've been Secretary of State, I've been privileged to have many great jobs and assignment and work for lots of wonderful people. But if it all had ended as just a lieutenant colonel serving 20 years and then going into retirement with my pension, that would have been good too. But I'm just privileged to have had the opportunity to serve, and if people remember me as someone who served well and faithfully, that's enough.
What is Colin Powell thinking about when he's alone these days? You're approaching 70. You are now a wise man of American life. What are you thinking about?
I think about the world a lot. I think about the problems that we still have to work our way through. But you can't just live on problems. You can't just live thinking about problems. It'll depress you. So I also think about the good things that we've been able to do and the new world that we have been able to help create. I think about the fact that we're able to get the peace agreement in Sudan between the North and the South. If only we could do something now in Darfur to end that terrible problem. And so I worry about those things. But I also think about how can we continue to build our relationship with Europe? No world war in Europe. First time in 200 years, nobody's facing a world war in Europe. How do we continue to build on that and bring all the nations into the democratic column? How can we continue to move in the right direction with China and push back on this suggestion that China is going to be an enemy? China's not going to be an enemy. They're selling too much stuff to Walmart. They're not crazy. And they're lending us the money to buy it. I mean, this is... And so I think about how do we build on that? I think about some of the business interests I have in Silicon Valley, and we're looking at new ways of sharing information. We're looking at biomedicine. We're looking at fuel cells and new battery technology. I'm trying to think through how we use these technological breakthroughs to improve the human condition, and especially to help kids in need in our country. And more importantly, how do we help kids in need throughout the world? What can we do about infectious diseases and HIV/AIDS? But I always see problems alongside of opportunities and opportunities alongside problems. I always try to see the good with the bad. Otherwise, you can become rather jaundiced in your view of the world. And it's a great world still, and it's a great country we're living in. It's a country that's still looked up to and respected, even though sometimes it is resented and looked down on. But they're still lining up at all of our embassies to come here. Walk through any community in America and you'll see a diversity that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world as people come here. Just get a New York City cab and drive around for a little bit and talk to the driver. And he'll tell you what the real America is all about.
General Powell, I can't say thank you enough for sharing with all of us your remarkable journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For more information or to order your own copy of An Evening with Colin Powell, please visit thehistorymakers.org or call 866-914-1900. That's 866-914-1900. The preceding program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org. The following program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org. Born on the rich soil of New Orleans, Andrew Young rose to become one of the most influential men of our time. A faithful servant of God, a courageous warrior in the struggle against injustice, and a powerful political leader. His legacy has been intertwined with the transformation of America. We are proud to present to you An Evening with Andrew Young. And now to our host, award-winning author and journalist Charlene Hunter Gault.
Thank you and good evening. It is such a pleasure for me to be here tonight. When the History Makers asked me to come from Johannesburg to do this, I didn't hesitate 1 minute because it is an honor for me to honor my friend, Andrew Young. You know, Andrew was born in the rich soil of New Orleans, but it was segregated soil. And yet he rose to become one of the most influential leaders of our time. And so tonight I'm going to ask you to join with me in looking at the life and inspiration of a man who's been an inspiration to all of us.
I was born at the beginning of an era of enormous change. Change so great, it will be called the Second American Revolution.
The modern world was in crisis, and with that crisis came an opportunity for my generation to change America in a way that was good news for all Americans.
We would try to change the world morally. We would redeem the soul of America.
I am Andrew Young.
I am Andrew Young.
I am Andrew Young.
Please join me in welcoming Andrew Young. Once again, welcome, Andy. It's such a pleasure for me to be here in our city, Atlanta, a city I know that we both hold dear. It's hard to think of Atlanta without thinking of Andy Young, and Andy Young without his Atlanta. But you were actually, as I said earlier, born in New Orleans, March 12, 1932. What was it like for you growing up in the 30s and 40s in New Orleans?
Actually, I enjoyed my childhood, and I grew up in a neighborhood that was Little United Nations. There was an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on the other. The German-American Bund was on the third corner. And so even as 4- or 5-year-old, I was listening to people Heil Hitler and sing Deutschland über alles. And my father, as a dentist, had a large connection with the Jewish community in the dental supply business. And so I got a very significant political education very early. We talked a lot about what was going on in Europe.
And you understood it?
I don't know whether I understood it, but my father took me to see Jesse Owens in the movie Told News win 4 Olympic gold medals, and Hitler walk out without shaking his hand, refusing to meet him. And he said, "See, that's a sickness. That racism's a sickness. You don't get angry with sick people. You help them. You heal them." And he raised me, I think, you know, to don't get mad, get smart.
Well, you know, there's a wonderful scene in your autobiography, An Easy Burden, that is a very good reflection of that family you just described. Let's look at it.
I was born in March 1932 in a New Orleans shotgun-style house. To Andrew Young, a dentist, and Daisy Fuller Young, a former school teacher. Within 2 years, my brother Walter was born, and we were virtually raised together. We were treated as a pair by relatives.
Andrew and Walter.
They'd say. When we were old enough, we would sit in church, or a good part of it, following Sunday school. We used the Pilgrim hymnals, which had both the English and the German hymns.
Oh, yes, hallelujah. Yes, Lord, thank you, Jesus. Amen, praise him, Lord, praise him.
The congregation intensely disapproved of black praise songs and emotional outbreaks. The only element of the service that reflected the particular culture of the congregation was the inclusion of the Negro spirituals. The choir sang, "Steal away." We are climbing Jacob's ladder. "Lord, I want to be a Christian." "Steal away," and other songs of the African-American tradition. In those days of the Great Depression, Jim Crow was the law of the South. And in polite society, we were known as colored people. The attitude of my parents' generation, of our teachers, seemed to be that we should concentrate our efforts on improving the race. And not just improving the level of education, but improving moral behavior. Daddy taught me
Racism is a sickness. You must have compassion for racist whites as you would have compassion for a polio victim. Racism was not a problem with you.
He told me.
It's a problem that they have.
Daddy had a genuine turn the other cheek attitude, although he didn't believe in becoming a victim. Now, Ma and Gran weren't quite so gentle.
Gran!
I said one night while reading of the Old Testament.
There's these boys that come by calling us niggers.
Gran sat up straight.
If they call you nigger, you got to fight them. If you don't fight them when they call you nigger, and I find out about it, I'm gonna whip you myself.
And the next time those boys came on Cleveland Avenue yelling,
Nigger, nigger, nigger!
Walter and I lit out after them, and surprise of all surprises, the boys ran.
Yes! They were prepared to call us names, but they weren't prepared to fight.
I'm sure that brings back memories. Your father, Andrew Jackson Sr., we just heard, a dentist. Your mother, Daisy Fuller, a retired school teacher. And of course, your mother and your father believed in, I believe, 3 things you wrote about: God, hard work, and education.
Well, they did, and that was the congregational tradition. The Congregational Church really came south, starting at Howard University, then Atlanta University, and Fisk, Talladega, Dillard, or Straight College back in those days, and Lincoln Normal in Alabama, where my wife went to school, and where her mother and father in Coretta got an education.
The era that we grew up, everybody had something to do with trying to make you somebody, and you had teachers that, one in particular, I believe, who tried to impress upon you the lessons of W.E.B. Du Bois and the Talented Tenth. Talk about that just a little bit, and did it have any effect?
Well, I think that I always knew from Miss Fannie C. Williams and Valina C. Jones Elementary School that, same message. For those to whom much has been given, of them will much be required. It was very uncomfortable because the teachers and the principal expected me to be a leader in the class.
You managed to graduate from Gilbert Academy when you were just 15 years old, and then you went to Dillard for a year, which was your father's alma mater. What was that like for you?
Well, it was fun because I was 15, but the 2 guys I was running with were just back from the Army, and one was 29, the other was 31.
How'd you hook up with them?
They sort of adopted me, made me sort of a mascot. And, but I also had a car. I mean, I could use my parents' car. You could drive in Louisiana at 15. They wouldn't let me try to keep up, but I had to stay sober, so if they got drunk, I could get them and the girls home.
Now, in the fall of 1948, still younger than most, you left New Orleans and went to Washington, D.C., to Howard University. What was it like for you leaving home for the first time at such a young age?
Well, I'd been to California that summer, and I went to summer school at University of Southern California, and I didn't like it because I was the only black person on the campus. So when I came back, I was glad to go to Howard. And I fell right in with the guys in the dormitory. And it was the first time I had met some people who were very proud to be scholars. That was a different world from where I'd been.
You know, we have a scene from that different world from your years at Howard. Let's take a look at it.
My sophomore year, I transferred to Howard University. I made the Howard track and swimming team, becoming in my senior year the #1 dash man on the team, winning my events in several meets. For some odd reason, though, I was never really accepted by the coach. Coach Hart had his favorites, and it amuses me even to this day how he seemed to be so outdone that I outran his chosen few. So outdone that he never gave me a pair of shoes. Despite my love of sports and many other aspects of my time at Howard, I found the atmosphere on the campus to be imbued with a haughtiness and a pretense that I found unappealing. This was the first place that I had ever been that people would walk by each other on campus and did not speak. Girls were society conscious to an extreme. Some of them wore high heels, cocktail dresses, and fur coats to class, as if their sole purpose was to snare a future physician or attorney. I found myself gravitating towards students that had a sense of purpose that I lacked. One student that I greatly admired was Emmanuel Lutunde Odeku from Nigeria. Odeku was brilliant, and he had a certain arrogance about black men that was typical of certain Nigerians.
I shall sleep for 2 hours after dinner, then arise and study until 3 or 4 in the morning. Then I shall sleep for 2 hours in the morning and take another nap for an hour after lunch.
Incredibly disciplined and organized. Odeku was a scholar, an athlete, and a true gentleman. He completed his studies at Howard in 2.5 years, finishing summa cum laude. I, on the other hand, graduated from Howard, not magna cum laude, but...
Oh, thank you, Lordy!
And I now realize that my years spent at Howard were important to my personal development. I learned that it was possible, even desirable, to have a black identity without being poor. My parents had shown me this. Their friends had shown me this. But it was only at Howard that I learned to accept this for myself.
And even given all of the things you've talked about in your aptitudes in school, you still graduated from Howard at 19 years old in 1951. This was a pivotal time for you. Why was that?
Well, I just kept drifting on, trying not to make my daddy mad.
He wanted you to be a dentist.
He wanted me to be a dentist, and I knew I wasn't going to be a dentist, but I didn't have enough nerve to tell him. And it wasn't until after I graduated and had something of a religious experience on the way to Kings Mountain, at Kings Mountain, North Carolina, and in the sense, religious in the sense that I realized that a college education is a tremendous opportunity and blessing. And I had just about blown it. And so I didn't go home for Thanksgiving, I didn't go home for Christmas. Once I got into studies, that's all I did for a solid year. Didn't date, didn't write. I lived really an ascetic life, practically.
You went to a church as an assistant in Marion, Alabama.
Well, I was the preacher
and you
in
spent
Marion,
that summer living with the Childs family. Who else was in that family?
Well, I wasn't really living there. I did live there. I wasn't spending the night there, but...
Come on, Andy, tell us who else was in the family.
Well, there was a nice little lady by the name of Jean Childs, who, interestingly enough, was in Manchester College, a school where they studied nonviolence. It was the Church of the Brethren school. I had, by that time, started reading Gandhi. And Gandhi's simple life, the idea that you shouldn't, have any wealth or property, and that you should devote your life to helping other people. That's what put me in the clash with all of the girls I'd been around at Howard. Jean was totally different. She was from the country. She and Coretta had gone to the same high school and had pretty much the same kind of upbringing. It was a rough kind of segregated town that was particularly hard on young black women. And so she had a maturity and a commitment about her to change the South that I had never seen in a woman.
You received your Bachelor's of Divinity degree, Bachelor of Divinity, in January '55. And then you began your first pastorates at Bethany Congregational Church in Thomasville, and then Evergreen Church in Beachton. And we have a scene from that.
Yes, Lord.
Lead me on.
Yes, Lord. Yes.
Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Yes, Lord.
Yes.
Amen.
Yes.
Evergreen Church forced me right away to modify the laid-back style of service that I had so carefully groomed at Hartford Seminary. My training at Hartford Seminary taught me to develop a simple, direct message with a tightly organized order of worship. This approach never worked at Evergreen. Anytime there was a lull in the service, the congregation automatically slipped into one of those old-time gospel hymnals. They get their rhythm going, clapping and tapping their feet, which left me to ask myself the only question: how could I regain control of the service without asking the congregation to be quiet? After a few tries of delivering a sermon that would have been acceptable to my seminary professors, I was given this advice by the deacon of the congregation.
Some of our folks don't trust the preacher with a whole lot of paper.
Well.
The Lord don't need that paper to make himself heard.
That's right.
Amen, Deacon. That's right. They see a lot of paper, and they think the devil done got up in your preacher.
Yes.
Amen. The deacon's insistence that I preach from the heart and not from the paper turned out to be a real blessing. It allowed me to grow more with them, and it also allowed me to enjoy the church's lovely, soft communal hums. My youth drew a lot of attention. Jean was a Sunday school teacher. She taught because she liked doing it, and she never felt any other obligation to conform in any other ways. After church on Sundays, we would play ball with the kids. We would attend dances that were given by friends, and Jean wore shorts in our yard. And not surprisingly, we were criticized for it. In my concept of a non-traditional ministerial role, I know it made my marriage work. As for Jean, she was very clear that she was not
going to be a typical minister's wife.
As she told our friends in Thomasville.
I don't sing, I don't play the piano, I can't direct the choir, and I'm not interested in being a social butterfly.
That's all right, sister.
But the Evergreen congregation was so loving and accepting that I quickly learned to be comfortable with this new style. No matter what I said.
Today we're going to study.
Deacon Spearman hummed.
True.
Or,
well, praise the Lord.
And soon they got their rhythm going, and then they pulled me into their rhythm, and before long I found my own rhythm. And I learned the old hymns and the ancient spirituals that I'd not written down, like
Jesus on the main line, tell him what you want. Jesus on the main line, tell him what you want. Hallelujah. Jesus on the main line, tell him what you want. You just call him up and tell him what you want.
Tell us a little bit about those early years where you were finding your way as a preacher and as a young family man. What was it like?
I came to love and appreciate small town life and people, country people, who still had, I think what I have now seen is a closer link to our African heritage than we do in most cities.
It was about this time, too, I think around 1956, that you organized a voter education, voter registration rally in Thomasville. Were you having to consciously balance your activism at that point with your preaching and pastoring?
It wasn't a balance. It was all one ministry. In fact, it was a Mother's Day, and I was preaching about the Christian family, and one of my deacons and one of the mothers in the church got in a fight. And they were sitting in church he came home drunk. And Miss Leola didn't stand for that. So she took an axe handle to him. And in the process of taking the axe handle from her, she got her hit upside the head. He'd been hit upside the head, but they were still right there in front. And I'm supposed to be preaching about the Christian family. And fortunately, I found out what happened. And what happened was he'd been the caretaker on one of these plantations down there. And he'd been making $75 a week, even though he'd been there for 30 years. And then a young white man came, young white boy came, 19 or 20 years old, and was put in charge of him. And he had to teach the white boy everything to do on the plantation. And then he realized that the white boy got $140 and he didn't get but $75. And he went out not able to deal with that and got drunk. Well, she didn't understand the background, but fortunately, the other members in my church were very sensitive to that. They told me what happened. So in my Mother's Day sermon, I had to make the leap from it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save men's souls to going to break down the dividing walls of hostility that separated Jew from Greek in the New Testament, but in our time separates black from white. And the link to say from preaching to end in segregation came very almost automatic. Now, about the same time, Maynard's grandfather, John Wesley Dobbs, invited us up to Columbus for the Masonic Lodge effort to have a statewide voter registration campaign. And they asked if somebody would I be willing to try to lead a voter registration campaign in Thomasville. And John Wesley Dobbs said he would be glad to come down to kick it off. Well, I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. I thought that was a wonderful opportunity, which it was.
But was it dangerous?
Well, I didn't know then, but coming back from Albany, Georgia, driving through Moultrie, the back road, we turned the corner in a place called Doe Run, Georgia.
Doe Run?
Doe Run. And there must have been 400 or 500 people in sheets.
Oof.
And I figured that they were coming to stop this voter registration drive. We hadn't seen anything like that before. And that's where I had my first marriage crisis, because even though I believed in nonviolence, I'd also read Reinhold Niebuhr, which said you're supposed to negotiate from a position of strength. So I told Jean that, I said, I'm going down, if they come here, I'm going down to talk to them. But I want you to point the rifle at the guy that I'm talking to. And I just want to let him know that if he messes with me, you're going to take him out. And then we can talk like from an equal footing, see? And I'll be negotiating from a position of strength. And she said, are you crazy? And I said, well, I might be, but we're going to have to do it. She said, no, you think I'm going to point a gun at a human being? I said, we used to shoot all the time. That was one of the things you did in the country for recreation. Put up a bunch of cans and, knock the cans off the stump.
And Jean could shoot?
She could shoot.
So what happened?
She said, no. She said, you don't believe this stuff you preaching? I said, well, Andrew, we got a 3-month-old baby here. This house will go up in smoke if they so much as throw a firebomb here. And she said, well, you preaching all this stuff about cross and resurrection. If you don't believe it, you ought to quit. I said, oh, what kind of fool did I marry? This woman is crazy. And fortunately, some of our members, the Glens, called us. They realized what was going on and invited us over to their house. Well, that broke the stalemate. But the other thing was that businessmen in the community and the black community had gotten together. And Sunnyland Packing Company and Flowers Bakery were the two biggest employers, and they went on their plant microphones and urged people not to involve in the Klan rally and said, we have good race relations here. We get along here, let's don't mess it up. And the Klan had its rally on the courthouse steps, but they didn't bother anybody in the black community. John Wesley Dobbs came in that Sunday, and he preached a magnificent sermon, and I'll never forget the punchline was, stick with this blue-eyed boy, but watch him.
And then a year later, you met a man you'd soon be working with, Dr. Martin Luther King. What was your first impression of him?
Well, my first impression of Martin Luther King was that he was so impressed with being a father that he wasn't interested in, I mean, I was trying to impress him with the fact I knew he got his PhD on Paul Tillich, and I had read Paul Tillich, and I was trying to let him, he couldn't care less. He was totally focused on Coretta and Yoki, his baby. I mean, the high point in his life was that he had a new little girl. And we never talked anything but baby talk. Because Andrea was about a year old, and Yoki was 3 or 4 months, and we ended up playing with our babies.
In 1957, you also accepted a position in New York with the youth department of the National Council of Churches, and you had to leave Thomasville. Was that difficult?
It was difficult to leave Thomasville, but we always said that the way I decided what I would do with my life was do something that nobody else wanted to do. And nobody else wanted to go to Thomasville. Nobody else wanted to go to Marion. And when I was offered the job at New York, there was no other black person that had any kind of experience in the Christian youth movement. Gene was expecting Lisa. And
number 2.
She was number 2. And Reb Stanley found another minister who was looking for a church, and he wanted to come the 1st of July. We were basically being run out of town because there was another preacher who wanted to move in with his family. There was nobody to do what they wanted me to do in New York. But we didn't, I mean, Gene did not like New York.
But you grew in New York. You expanded. Tell us just a little bit about
that. Well, I grew because one of my first assignments was with CBS to sort of help produce a program for Christian young people called Look Up and Live. We had a half hour every Sunday morning, 13 Sundays. And I had to come up with a program and find ways to interpret the gospel to a new generation of young people. And it's where I got to know people like Dave Brubeck and the Modern Jazz Quartet, all of the old blues and jazz people who were expressing the youth culture at that time. We were able to get on the show and begin to make the connection between secular culture and what was happening in the jazz world and blues and what the gospel said.
Mm. You also began to make international connections. You traveled internationally during that period?
Well, Gene and I had gone to Europe in 1953. And so I'd been abroad, and but I went to a number of delegations with Christian youth folk, went to Latin America, went to several times to Geneva, I became a pretty comfortable international traveler.
And then there came a time when you decided to come back to the South.
Well, we blame that on John Lewis because we were watching the Nashville sit-in story on television. We'd bought a house in Long Island, and Jean was just about to complete her master's, and she was expecting Paula. We saw the Nashville sit-in story, and we both said, you know, it's time to go back home. And we'd always said we weren't going to stay in New York more than 5 years. And this was coming on 4 years. So it was complicated, but I quit my job, sold my house, and was planning to come to work for Highlander Folk School because I wanted to write about the movement. I didn't want to get involved in it.
Why was that?
Because I figured that what has happened, that other people would interpret our history, and that I needed to be close. Highlander was where the students were trained for the sit-ins, and where Rosa Parks went, but it wasn't in the middle of the movement. It was sort of like in the eye of the storm. It was quiet and peaceful up in the Tennessee mountains.
It was religious?
No, it was well, they closed it down because they said it was communist. But it was a old labor organizing center that was closed by the state of Tennessee, and they accused Septima Clark, who was a wonderful lady in her 60s, of carrying out 26 gallons of moonshine in two suitcases. I mean, but they closed it down, and so I had sold my house, I quit my job, and I had no place to go.
So is that how you ended up at SCLC?
That's how I ended up at SCLC. I went to the United Church of Christ Board for Homeland Ministries, and I knew about Dorchester Center near Savannah. And I asked them, could we take the program that was at Highlander, a literacy program teaching people to read and write in order to register to vote, could we move that to Dorchester Center? And they said, we'd be glad to move it, and we can put some money to fix up the building too, but we need you to go down to be the administrator.
And you went.
And we went.
Okay, now you began gradually working with Dr. King during this time, and we have a scene that will tell us a little bit more about that.
Martin understood that the mantle of leadership had been thrust upon him. However, I was determined to at least keep Martin from participating in demonstrations at night. He would say,
Andy, I have to do everything everybody else does.
I would answer,
no, Martin, that's not true. If you're out there and they're shooting at you, they're liable to miss you and hit some of us. If we stay here at the church, they won't do any shooting.
On this point, Martin reluctantly accepted my logic. Martin was always philosophical about the internal tensions and about the violence that accompanied our efforts.
Andy, you are too rational. If you had your way, we would never have a confrontation. But you need confrontation to bring the horror and violence of racism to the surface, where it can be exposed to truth and be healed.
Martin did have a side that wasn't so serious. When Ralph Abernathy started complaining,
I am never allowed to speak at the march,
Martin responded with,
now, Ralph, you have to be a head of an organization to speak. Now, what we need to do is find you an organization that you can be the head of, so that on next March you can have the right to speak.
And everybody present agreed that the one organization that Ralph was unquestionably the president of was the
National Association for the Advancement of
Eating Chicken. Martin waxed eloquent, saying,
no one can challenge your preeminence. You would have no competition.
Oh, we laughed. Big, deep belly laughs, releasing all the tensions of the day. Martin could tease. He could crack on you, he could insult you until the whole room was laughing until they cried. But it was never in anger, never in bitterness. It was always in fun. Martin never teased anyone that he didn't love. Martin could relax this way only with the people that he trusted, his closest colleagues and his personal friends. None of us were saints. Saints could not have endured the rigors of the movement, could not have accomplished what we had accomplished in so short of a time. We were flesh and blood human beings, men and women, flawed and imperfect, and we fell far short of the glory of God. But we changed America, and we did it without hurting anyone, except ourselves.
That was a pretty powerful scene. I mean, recalling how young people, because you were still young then, were agents of change, that we were all involved in something. We had this wonderful camaraderie, but we were also involved in something larger than ourselves. How do you, now that that time is over, but how do you convey that to a younger generation and help them be prepared for challenges that they might confront?
I don't know, it's difficult, but nobody prepared us. And when the time came, we just stood up and did what we had to do. And I was saying that usually we were staying up late at night trying to make sure we knew what we were going to do the next morning. And we'd always go in with a long, serious battle plan, which Wyatt Walker was great at putting down plans on paper. But once you got in a situation, nothing ever worked out like you thought it was.
Is there any one moment that stands out in your life, either in your mind as a triumphant moment or the most challenging moment?
Yeah, I think the moment that Martin took the leadership of the movement.
When was that?
It was in Birmingham, and I think that through the sit-ins and through the freedom rides, even Albany, Georgia, he was being pushed by other people. And we didn't go in there prepared. We were responding to other people's crises. And that's what they were talking about, because Jose was the same way. And Bevel was logical, but almost suicidal. I mean, he just thought you had to plan to get killed. See? And he'd say things like, he said, if you ask somebody to chop off an arm, they look at you like you're crazy. He said, but you ask them to give you your life for something. He said, the chances are they'll do it. Mm. And sure enough, he was always putting us into positions where other folk were risking their lives. I think the only time I got really cussed out by Martin was once when I agreed with him.
With those,
with
the younger Turks.
Well, yeah, they weren't that much younger. Jose was older than me, but Jose was in a foxhole in the Second World War. It was a direct hit. Everybody in the foxhole was killed by him. And then he was in an ambulance, and on the way back to the field hospital, the ambulance was hit. And the ambulance driver was killed, and he was still laying in the back. Well, he spent 11 months in a hospital in England, wondering why he was alive and everybody else had been killed, and comes back in the bus station in Macon, Georgia. He tries to get a drink of water. In his Army uniform, on a cane, 40% disabled veteran, and somebody roughs him up, trying to, not for drinking out of a fountain, he bought a coffee cup, and they wouldn't sell him the cup, they made him buy the coffee, and he emptied the coffee, rinsed the coffee cup out, and was drinking out of a cup. And a bunch of folk, because the fountain said white only, a bunch of young kids roughed him up, and he just decided that that's what the Lord saved him for, was to end segregation. Mm. So he was anxious, and he figured his life had been spared, and he was ready to give it every day. Well, I just figured you need to be a little careful.
Okay, now you started to tell us, why you thought Martin Luther King's taking over the movement was probably the most triumphant moment for you.
Well, because we had done everything that we thought we could do. There were about 300 or 400 kids in jail. Well, they said kids, but the first demonstrator was 78 years old in Birmingham. So we ran through all old people. We were down to the college students. And the business leadership came to visit Dr. King and asked him, said, you just need to know that you failed, that, it was no fault. Birmingham was just too much. These people don't respond to nonviolence. And we think you need to leave and go around the country and preach and raise enough money to get these folk out of jail, and then come back to Birmingham in another year or so. And he sat there and listened to him. And then he got up and went in the next room, and when he came back, he had on his overalls. And he said, I'm sorry, gentlemen. He said, you probably are right. He said, but there's no way I can leave. The only thing I can do is go to jail with them.
And that was the turning point.
And then it was that was a Thursday. That Sunday, the preachers had the attack on the movement in the Sunday paper. That was blaming us for stirring up all the trouble in Birmingham. And he read that and wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail. And he wrote it around the margins of the New York Times on toilet tissue. And to show you how ignorant we were and how we didn't realize the significance of it, the young lady who was typing it, after we'd smuggled it out of the jail, she stayed up all night typing and was cussing and fussing. Dr. King got a PhD, he can preach, but he sure can't write. Andy, what is this word? You know, and when she'd finish, she'd crawl up the paper and throw it in the trash can. And I didn't have sense enough to stop her. And it wasn't until the letter got finished, and I think the Quakers published about 100,000 of them, of copies of it, and it went all over the world. And that was the turning point.
And of course, the rest, as they say, is history. You know, as rich and as rewarding, albeit as challenging, as dangerous as that period was for you, many things were accomplished through the SCLC and your involvement with Dr. King and your other comrades. But in 1970, you resigned to enter the political arena, which ushered in a new chapter of your life. Let's take a look at that.
In 1970, Andrew Young resigned from his post at SCLC. The political chapter of his life had begun, and in the years to come, he would influence communities locally and across the globe. On November 7, 1972, Young was elected as the first black representative from Georgia since Reconstruction.
I'd like for us to remember what it was like back in March when we first began this campaign. I'd like for us to remember that we were talking about a district that was on the verge of pulling apart. We were talking about a political climate that said no decent man, or moderate or liberal, could get elected whether he was black or white. I'd like for us to remember that everybody said that this campaign was impossible.
I think I'll be the only congressman who happens to be black who's from a majority white district. And I think the fact that that district is a Deep South district is very significant. It means that we are beginning to do what I say we are going to have to do. That is, that the South is going to have to show the nation how we can live and work together as brothers.
1973 proved to be an important year. His son, Andrew Young III, affectionately known as Bo, was born on February 13th, and Young was sworn into office where he served 3 terms. In 1976, Young was appointed as United States Ambassador to the United Nations. As ambassador, Young advocated for impoverished citizens around the globe. His commitment and devotion rose above political agenda. However, politics would have their way, forcing Young's resignation.
I'm with Andrew Young all the way. I think it's the best thing to happen to Americans' foreign policy in a world that is replete with instances of injustice in a long, long time. Now, the fact that he is not typical of diplomats in an arena which finds it very hard to deal with the truth and with candor will create problems for him.
Undaunted, Young went on to serve as mayor of Atlanta for 2 terms.
There's not a city in America where black people have made the strides that they have made in Atlanta. You probably have more college graduates in Atlanta that are black. You probably have more black business in Atlanta. You probably have certainly more universities run by black people here. You have better housing in Atlanta. And I dare say you have better secondary schools in Atlanta than most black people anywhere else in the world.
Under his leadership, millions of jobs were created and the city of Atlanta flourished. Young brought worldwide attention to Atlanta when he successfully negotiated to have the 1996 Olympics held in Atlanta. On March 28, 1996, Young would take Carolyn McLean as his bride in a private ceremony in South Africa, where Bishop Desmond Tutu married the couple and Ambassador James Joseph and his wife Mary were in attendance. They have worked closely together in their company, Good Works International, which is devoted to fostering U.S. investment and generating jobs in South Africa and in the Caribbean. Today, Andrew Young is one of our nation's most honored civic leaders turned private citizen. He continues to advocate staunchly for human rights and justice around the world, truly demonstrating a lifetime of civic and spiritual devotion.
Okay, let's uncouple a little bit of that. Tell us about your historic election in November 7th, 1972. It was the first black U.S. representative from Georgia since Reconstruction.
Well, basically, the community just pulled together behind me, and everybody did. And it poured down rain, and people got out in the rain and voted. I remember getting mad with Jesse Hill because he put it in the paper that I was behind by 4 percentage points. And I said, Jesse, what you want to say that for? He said, just leave it alone, leave it alone. I know what I'm doing.
But did you feel the historic significance of this?
Not really. I mean, you know, I didn't. But what happened was, when people felt that I was behind, if they felt that I was ahead, they might have said, I don't have to go to vote in the rain. But the fact that they thought I was behind, you know, really had people lined up in the rain. It was almost like South Africa, you know, where they just got out and voted. And that was, for me, that was a mandate from the South. That was also the same election where Richard Nixon beat McGovern. And so for me to get elected when Georgia went overwhelmingly Republican, and for the South, the Southern strategy to divide and conquer in the Republican Party was, we were running against that. We were saying, we can hold the South together, black and white together. And Atlanta did that. And I think that Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 and in many ways internationalized the nonviolence of Martin Luther King. And for 4 years, in Panama, in Camp David, in Southern Africa, with the Russians, the Chinese, and the Vietnamese came back into the UN, and we did everything America needed to do, and no American soldier got killed, and no American soldier killed anybody.
So as the United States ambassador to the United Nations, what was your most significant accomplishment?
I think that, well, I learned to appreciate Ralph Bunche. And Ralph Bunche always said that there's no, you know, you don't want people to know what you're doing. He said, if you stay behind the scenes, you can get a whole lot done. And the less people know about what you're doing, the better off you are. And I think most of the things that I've accomplished, nobody knows about.
And tell us one that we don't know about that made you feel good.
I mean, like, I was behind the scenes very much in the Panama Canal Treaty. In fact, I went down to Panama the year before Jimmy Carter was elected and kind of knew what the Panamanians wanted. In Camp David, that was very delicate negotiations where, I mean, Begin and Sadat wouldn't even talk to each other. Jimmy Carter was running back and forth between the houses, but you had to keep the UN on board. And so I was making the rounds to all of the Arab ambassadors, the Israeli ambassador, and keeping everybody informed so that they knew what we were trying to do. And the same thing with Southern Africa. Normally, the Russians or the Chinese would not have let America take the leadership that we took in Southern Africa. And they did.
And the result was?
The result was independence of Namibia, independence of Zimbabwe, and eventually the liberation of South Africa.
End of apartheid.
End of apartheid.
Now, that international stage that you worked on for so long, you then brought all of that experience back and served as mayor in Atlanta for 8 years.
Well,
what inspired you to run for that office?
When I came back to Atlanta, I really did not want to go back in politics, but Maynard set me up, and I told him I did not want to be mayor. And he said, well, just come to a meeting and help us figure out who ought to be mayor. And when I got there, Miss Susie Laborde, who was head of the welfare rights movement and senior citizens, got up with her cane and she said, "Look here, boy." She said, "You wasn't nothing when you came here." She said, "We made you somebody." I said, "Well, Martin Luther King." She said, "We made him too." And she said, if you let us down now, we done wasted our time on you.
That was it.
I said, "Lord have mercy."
She had you.
I mean,
She
there was
had
no
you.
way. And I said, "But I don't know." I said, "You know, Reagan is the president. There's no money in Washington. They're not going to help you at the state capitol." And I said, all of you all are going to be out there picketing me when I have to cut back the budget and lay people off. And she said, "Well." And I said, but what am I going to do? She said, "I don't know, but if you don't know, who else knows?" So that's what we want you to figure out.
And you figured it out. And what do you think was your greatest achievement as mayor of Atlanta?
Bringing the money in. We brought in $70 billion worth of private direct investment, and we brought in 1,100 companies in those 8 years.
Tell us about Good Works and Carolyn and
After the Olympics, Carl Masters and Carl was with the Toronto Olympic team committee, and we said, "You know, we've raised $2.5 billion here in Atlanta for a 2-week track meet." You know, and it was wonderful and everything, but why can't we do that for Africa?
So Good Works aims at doing what?
Well, Good Works aims at bringing pride. Well, see, what made Atlanta work was not government money. We got no government money from Washington or from state capitol. All this was private money. We said, we have to help Africans learn, and people in the Caribbean learn that they've got to learn to work with the private sector. It's the private sector that creates jobs. It's the private sector that grows economies. Private sector holds all the technology. So we've been trying to relate African development to private sector, corporations.
I'm sure we could learn a lot about that, but in the few minutes we have left, you've devoted so much time to Africa. Do you see that somehow, that frontier, as a logical extension of your civil rights work here in America?
It's not only the logical extension of the civil rights movement, but every time something happened here, something happened in South Africa. And something happened, I mean, it's just been, it is one world. And things that happen anywhere, reverberate all around the world. Africa was the part of the world I knew, and where I knew people and where I felt a kinship. I also felt that because white people had come from the north and come south and educated my grandparents, that we had a responsibility to pass that on. I don't like giving back. See, I think you pass it on to the next generation and to other places. And I thought that Africa really is what's missing in the world. That all of the protectionism fights with Europe and Asia, if we were producing goods for Africa, Africa can absorb all that we can produce, and they can pay for it. And Africa can make the global economy work if people learn to work with Africa and respect Africa. And we do.
Finally, Andrew Young, one remaining question, and I ask this in light of your parents and your grandparents. What do you want your legacy to be?
You know, that I lived a long time and had a whole lot of fun doing it.
Great. What a remarkable life. You agree? I just want to thank Ambassador Andrew Young for this wonderful, insightful, and fun-filled evening. Thank you for sharing your journey with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Young.
For more information or to order your own copy of An Evening with Andrew Young, please visit thehistorymakers.org or call 866-914-1900. That's 866-914-1900. The preceding program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org.